unlimited access to the spa from now on. How could John keep this a secret? It's just evil, unforgivable. Without my knowledge, my in-laws' place had transformed into a luxury hotel. Now, I can enjoy the spa every day and indulge in delicious meals. But kidding aside, the thought of them using my precious son for their own desires, it's outrageous. They better be ready. My name is Amy, a 35-year-old office worker in the administrative department of a pharmacy. I live with my husband John and our first-grade son Edward. John and I met through a colleague at work, and from the moment we met, we clicked. We quickly became close, started dating, and were married the following year. With my upbeat husband John and lively son Edward, I was leading a life of ordinary happiness. Another thing that makes me glad I married John is having his mother-in-law Renda in our lives. Having lost my mother early, I was raised by my father. My mother-in-law, who I barely knew as a mother figure, treated me like her own daughter since the start of our marriage. "Amy, do you have any plans this Sunday? Why don't you and Edward come over for dinner?" she would say, always treating us to delicious meals. When Edward was younger, she was a great support for my parenting struggles, even helping to pick him up from daycare when I couldn't leave work. Edward grew very attached to her, and spending Christmas at my in-laws had become a tradition for our family. "Amy, your mother-in-law really is the best, isn't she?" my colleague Emma would say, listening with an envious look. It was Emma who introduced me to John. They had been friends since college. Emma, with her bright personality and many friends, joined the company with me. We were close enough to share work frustrations, family matters, and personal issues. The pharmacists and other staff were kind, and the company had excellent benefits. Emma and other colleagues with children continued to work full-time as before our pregnancies. Recently, John's been saying he has to work on weekends and isn't home even on his days off, I said, sounding a bit discontented. "Are you suspecting him of cheating?" Emma laughed. "That's laughable." But it was true. John had been away from home more often. "Dad, are you working again today?" Edward asked, wanting to play with John. "I have to work, sorry," John said apologetically. I couldn't say anything back, feeling proud of John for working hard for our family. Little did I know back then that such dedication would turn into such a terrible betrayal. Rock, paper, scissors. Oh, the worst, I sighed. My workplace is usually closed on Sundays and holidays, but about once a month, we're on duty for the hospital gate on Sundays. Accordingly, our pharmacy also opens. It seems Christmas is our turn this time. We played rock, paper, scissors to decide who would work. Unfortunately, I lost. I wanted to spend Christmas at my in-laws, but no choice. "I have to do my best," I muttered to myself, only to be chuckled at by the friend sitting next to me. "It's not funny," I said to her. She laughed and apologized. "Sorry. This woman is also an officer, and we met at the daycare. Her son Henry and Edward are very close, and our families have become friends. We used to go on trips together, though we've been too busy lately. Her husband Tom is also a kind and gentle person. Her name is Isabella. I call her Henry's mom, or Isabella. By the way, Isabella, thanks for playing with Edward in the park last Sunday when I had to work. When John had to take care of Edward on weekends, today I played with Henry in the park," Edward told me. When I asked John about it, he said he ran into Henry and his parents at the park by chance and played together. "Really?" I asked John, but his vague response frustrated me. "By the way, mother-in-law called and said she's looking forward to Christmas. I can't make it, but have fun. I can't go because of work, so it looks like Christmas will be without me this year," I told Isabella. Mother-in-law sounded very disappointed when I told her I couldn't come, but maybe I'll put John to work and have him do a thorough house cleaning. "It's been a while," she said, sounding quite excited about the idea. "Feel free to use him as much as you like," I laughed as I talked with mother-in-law. It was close to Christmas when this happened. I was working a late shift that day and had to do some unexpected overtime. I hurriedly tried to contact John but couldn't reach him. I ended up calling my son's mobile phone. "Mom, are you done with work?" Edward answered the phone with a cheerful voice, happy to hear from me. "Sorry, Edward, Mom is working late. Can you put Dad on the phone?" But Edward said John wasn't there. Wondering where they could be, I said, "Hello, Amy. It must be tough working so late." John called and said he's going to be late because of work, mother-in-law said. "Hello, Amy. It must be tough working so late." John called and said he's going to be late because of work, mother-in-law said. She told me that while she was preparing dinner in her house. John called her. Sorry, Mom. Amy's on a late shift and I should get home early, but I have to work overtime. Please help. After saying that, John hung up and couldn't be reached again. I was furious with John's actions. He hadn't contacted me at all, thinking maybe he wouldn't get caught. I rushed home. John still hadn't returned, and at the dinner table were mother-in-law and Edward, eating. Mother-in-law said she was happy to have dinner alone with her grandson. Even though I apologize, I really respect mother-in-law. John came home late that night. Hey, about work, you promised to take care of things when I have a late shift. Can you at least keep that promise? I said quietly, what can I do? It's work, I muttered to myself. John raised his voice and even suggested that I quit my job or become a part-timer. When John met me, he praised me for working in healthcare, but that John who said such nice things is no longer here. Our current lifestyle is also thanks to my income. Even though I'm an equal partner to John, he's been doing less housework lately and hasn't been taking care of Edward either. And this guy, hey, you're not cheating, are you? I looked at John with cold eyes. There's no way. You're overthinking, Amy. He suddenly changed his tone and put his arm around my shoulder. That said it all. John has always tried to appease me like this when he's lying or feeling guilty. How dare he cheat? He better be prepared. I was glad Edward was asleep. I didn't want to show our son such an ugly fight. From then on, we acted normal in front of Edward, but when it was just the two of us, we hardly talked or even made eye contact. When I told my colleague Emma about what happened, she said, "That guy is the worst. Let me know if you need anything." That was a cool thing to say. Days passed, and before I knew it, it was Christmas Eve. Take good care of Edward, will you? Say hello to Renda for me, I said to John, but as usual, he didn't even meet my eyes. I'm off then, he replied indifferently, and John and Edward left for my in-laws' house. What's with that attitude? It's so annoying, I thought to myself. I spent a lonely Christmas Eve alone in our eerily quiet house. There was no contact from John, but thinking he was having a good time with mother-in-law gave me a little peace of mind. I remembered mother-in-law saying she'd make John clean the house. I wondered if he was being worn out by chores and couldn't help but feel a bit of schadenfreude. Little did I know John was doing something unthinkable at that time. Christmas Day was busy with quite a few patients. Fortunately, I didn't have to work overtime, so I left work and went straight home. I planned to join my in-laws the next afternoon and spend the holiday with mother-in-law. Might as well enjoy some alone time for a change. As I was thinking this, my mobile phone rang. It was mother-in-law. Thinking it was going to be a complaint about John being lazy, I answered, "Amy, Merry Christmas. You must be tired from working on Christmas. You did great." Mother-in-law's voice sounded kind, not irritated at all. "Merry Christmas, Renda. I wish I could have spent it with you too. Is Edward just playing games?" When I asked, mother-in-law fell silent. Even after calling Renda's name a few times, there was no response. I wondered if it was a bad signal. "Amy, John and Edward didn't come here this year. I spent Christmas alone," mother-in-law finally said, and then began to sob over the phone. I was in a panic. John and Edward definitely left the house yesterday. Where could they possibly be now? There was a long silence between mother-in-law and me. "I'll head over to your place right now," I said. "It's about a 40-minute drive to my in-laws." On the way, my mind was filled with thoughts of Edward. What if they were involved in an accident or some incident? These worries spun in my head. When I arrived at my in-laws, mother-in-law was already waiting outside. As soon as she got into my car, I asked quietly, "Should we call the police?" Mother-in-law slowly shook her head. As I wondered why, mother-in-law began to speak. "Amy, I'm really sorry about my stupid son. Do you think John is having an affair?" Mother-in-law looked at me with teary eyes, and I almost started crying too. "What?" Actually, that's when I remembered something and hurriedly drove to a certain place. When we reached our destination, I called Edward's mobile phone. "Hello? Is Dad nearby?" I asked. "Yeah, he's here." "Come quickly, Mom," Edward answered immediately. Even though we had been apart for only a day, Edward's voice sounded dear to me. "What is it, Amy?" "I'm busy right now." I heard John's voice on the phone, sounding like he wanted to end the call. Immediately, hearing that voice made me feel intense loathing, wanting to confront him. "Renda, you said something about making him clean, right? So, are you at your parents' house now?" John's response on the phone was calm. Yeah, that's right, Amy. I can't wait to see you. When did he become so adept at lying as easily as breathing? I thought to myself, should I have quit my job? Should I have tried harder at home? But none of that justifies an affair. Oh, Sorenda, you started a luxury hotel. Does that mean unlimited spa access? How could John keep this a secret? I won't forgive him, I said in a low tone filled with hatred. On the phone, John seemed quite flustered by my accusation. His silence prompted me to continue. Hey, come out of the room. This is the luxury hotel I always wanted to visit. You said it was too expensive, remember? As I spoke fluently, John seemed to give up. I'm sorry, he said in a barely audible voice. I found this place using the GPS on Edward's mobile phone. This hotel, not far from my in-laws, was the place I wanted to visit. The fact that John, who said it was too expensive for me, was enjoying himself here with his mistress infuriated me. Perhaps it showed on my face because on the way to the hotel, mother-in-law kept apologizing. It was then that I found out for the first time that when I worked late shifts, mother-in-law was almost always the one taking care of Edward. I hadn't noticed because she would return home before I got back. John, who was terrible at cooking, used to buy ready-made food, and if mother-in-law tried to cook, he stubbornly refused her. Looking back, that must have been a strategy to keep me from finding out. Even during that short time, John was so enthralled with his mistress. Mother-in-law initially believed John was really working, but as his absences increased, her suspicions of an affair naturally grew. The climax was when mother-in-law saw John walking arm in arm with an unknown woman, looking intimate. She debated whether to consult me but decided against it. The main reason was that she didn't want to lose the chance to see Amy and Edward. Mother-in-law sobbed in the passenger seat, knowing she cared so much for us. Tears streamed down my cheeks too. Mother-in-law was more considerate of me and Edward than John ever was. This time, John had contacted her, saying he would spend some rare time alone with Edward, but asked her to cover for him, saying he'd be at her house. Mother-in-law, suspecting a lie, worried about Edward and contacted me. I despised John from the bottom of my heart for involving so many people, I thought bitterly. At the hotel, after explaining the situation, we were made to wait in the lobby. Then, a man and a woman with guilty expressions on their faces emerged, along with Mom. I was getting bored. I played a law with Henry, who was Edward's friend from daycare. Henry looked around and said, "Looks like my dad hasn't arrived yet." He seemed a bit disappointed. John's mistress was Isabella, another mom from the daycare. I wasn't sure how long the affair had been going on, but these two fools had boldly involved our children. Apparently, they had told their sons that their respective parents would join them later. How despicable. John had booked 2 rooms, one for the children and the other for themselves. So repulsive. Thanks to the hotel's kindness, mother-in-law and I were allowed to stay in a room for a while, where she looked after the children in the other room. Isabella, having an affair with my husband and then talking to me normally at committee meetings, was unbelievable. I spoke in a calm tone, why I thought Amy hadn't noticed anything. It was so funny. Isabella laughed. What is this woman? I never would have guessed that Isabella, who seemed so fragile and beautiful, was actually this spiteful. I stared at her quietly, pondering the unpredictability of people. John himself seemed a bit taken aback by Isabella's true nature. This woman, without being asked, happily began to talk about how and when she started her affair with John. Their relationship began when our children were in senior kindergarten. On a day I was sick and couldn't attend a parent meeting, so I asked John to go in my place. It was Isabella who made the first move. We had known each other as families and had each other's contact information. From that day on, they began to communicate more frequently. It started with complaints about their spouses but gradually turned into personal conversations. Soon, they began meeting more often, and it didn't take long for their relationship to become romantic. But now it's all over. What a pity, Isabella chuckled. Her nonchalant attitude heard loud and clear. I said, "You seem quite relaxed for someone about to face serious consequences." Ignoring her surprised look, I stood up decisively, facing my bewildered husband. I said, "Come on, get up and check out. I've called a ride for you, so get ready quickly," I said with a slight smile as I left the room. Seeing Isabella's face twitch a bit from my remark felt oddly satisfying. Now begins the hellish drive. The trip isn't over until we're home, I thought to myself. After checking out, as we headed to the parking lot, Henry ran joyfully towards the person he was waiting for, Henry's dad, Tom, Isabella's husband. "Sorry to keep you waiting, Henry. Have you been good?" Tom said in his usual calm manner. "Dad, can Edward and I go home first? Mom and you need to talk," Henry said gently, and the two boys happily got into my car. "Thank you. We'll have a long talk on the way home," I said, glaring at Isabella. I had learned from contacting Tom that he was supposedly at work and Isabella had lied about visiting her parents far away to come here. Both of them were utterly despicable. I was forced to come here because John threatened to use Edward to ostracize Henry at school if I didn't. Isabella started with a shallow lie. "Really? You seemed so eager to tell me everything just a while ago," I continued calmly. Isabella laughed. "What is this woman?" I thought, staring at her quietly, pondering the unpredictability of people. John himself seemed taken aback by Isabella's true nature. She happily began to talk about how and when she started her affair with John, and it was unbelievable to hear. Their relationship began when our children were in senior kindergarten. On a day I was sick and couldn't attend a parent meeting, so I asked John to go in my place. It was Isabella who made the first move. We had known each other as families and had each other's contact information. From that day on, they began to communicate more frequently. It started with complaints about their spouses but gradually turned into personal conversations. Soon, they began meeting more often, and it didn't take long for their relationship to become romantic. But now it's all over. "What a pity," Isabella chuckled with a nonchalant attitude. I said, "You seem quite relaxed for someone about to face serious consequences." I ignored her surprised look, standing up decisively, facing my bewildered husband. I placed the voice recorder with our earlier conversation in Tom's hand as Isabella desperately tried to grab it. "Don't bother. I have another copy just for myself," I said, smiling as I got into my car. As I drove away, John's pathetic voice called out from behind, "Wait, what am I supposed to do now? Go home alone? Oh, but I thought you might feel lonely, so I arranged a ride for you too." I pointed behind John. Behind him stood my colleague Emma and her husband, who was also a friend from college. Apparently, John owed him a big favor and couldn't stand up to him. I glanced over and saw they were already scolding him. Emma gave me a look that said, "Leave it to me." Though my husband was a disappointment, I was lucky to have supportive people around me. As I expected, everyone's ride home was hellish. Isabella desperately denied her relationship with John in the car, but no one believed her with the voice recorder playing. Eventually, she admitted to having other affairs. I don't know if John was serious, but he was the one being played from the start. The reason Isabella targeted John was so petty because Edward got the lead role in a school play over Henry. I was furious. I planned to make him pay a hefty alimony. Henry's custody went to Tom, of course. He said he was going back to his parents' place, a bit far away. John came home late that night, looking like a ghost. It seems like he got a good scolding from Emma and her husband. John always said his college friends were very important to him, as if it were a mantra from the beginning of our marriage. Now, because of this incident, John probably won't be invited to their gatherings anymore. It's nothing but karma. He brought this upon himself. He should regret it. What angered me the most was that every time he met his mistress, John told Edward, "Today it's a secret between us men, okay? Don't tell Mom." Edward kept that promise and never told me anything. When I found out, I was moved to tears. John and I successfully finalized our divorce. "You stupid man, how can you face your late father now? Don't ever show your face again," mother-in-law said, slapping him. John finally realized the gravity of his actions and cried like a child. But my heart didn't waver. Afterward, John requested a transfer to a branch outside the prefecture. He paid the alimony and is keeping up with child support. As for me and Edward, we're living with mother-in-law at her place. I considered returning to my parents' home, but my father has remarried and has a new family. Living together would be impossible. Mother-in-law suggested we stay with her until our lives stabilize. People are often surprised by our unique relationship. But I still cherish mother-in-law like my real mother. I hesitated about what to call her, but I still call her Renda. We're keeping it a secret, but we plan to celebrate her 60th birthday at that hotel. I splurged and booked the most expensive room. This should turn the unpleasant memories into enjoyable ones. My job became far, and Edward had to transfer schools, but Tom's parents lived near our former in-laws, so the boys ended up in the same school again. That was a surprise. Once things settle down, I might rent an apartment near work. But for now, I want to cherish this time a little longer.
My name is Irene, and I'm just a simple girl from a modest family. I graduated from college and started working as a nurse at City General Hospital. It wasn't glamorous, but I loved helping people and making a difference in their lives. On that fateful day, I was rushing through the emergency room, arms full of supplies, when the doors burst open. 2 paramedics wheeled in a stretcher, and on it lay a man in a torn leather jacket and shattered motorcycle helmet. "What happened?" I asked, immediately setting down my load and moving to assist. "Rich boy on a fancy bike lost control," one of the paramedics grunted. "Hit a guardrail. Lucky his gear held up, or he'd be in worse shape." Dr. Thompson, the attending physician, hurried over. "Irene, I need your help here." We worked quickly, removing the man's protective gear and assessing his injuries. Despite the severity of the crash, he seemed to have escaped with only a broken arm and some nasty bruises. As we cut away his shirt, I couldn't help but notice his toned physique and the expensive watch on his wrist. Where am I?" the man groaned, regaining consciousness. "You're at City General," I told him softly. "You've been in an accident, but you're going to be okay." His eyes fluttered open, revealing startling blue irises. He looked at me, dazed, then managed a weak smile. "An angel," he mumbled, before passing out again. I felt my cheeks flush and quickly busied myself with preparing his drip. "Looks like you've got an admirer, Irene," Dr. Thompson chuckled. "This is Jake Thornton, son of Richard Thornton. You know, the guy who owns half the city?" Over the next few days, I found myself assigned to Jake's room more often than not. He was healing well, but his cocky attitude was beginning to grate on my nerves. "Hey, Nurse Angel," he'd call out whenever I entered. "Come to make my day brighter?" I'd roll my eyes, trying to hide my blush. "I'm here to check your vitals, Mr. Thornton. Nothing more." Despite his arrogance, there was something about Jake that intrigued me. He was more than just a rich boy with a pretty face. When he thought I wasn't looking, I'd catch him reading complex financial reports or speaking fluent Mandarin on his phone. On the day of his discharge, I felt an unexpected pang of sadness. I told myself it was ridiculous, he was just another patient, and an annoying one at that. "Well, Nurse Angel," Jake said as he gathered his things, "I guess this is goodbye." "Take care, Mr. Thornton," I replied professionally. "Try to stay off motorcycles for a while." A week after Jake's discharge, I was going about my usual routine at the hospital. It was a quiet afternoon, and I was updating patient charts at the nurse's station when I heard a familiar voice. "Excuse me, I'm looking for Nurse Angel. Have you seen her?" I looked up, startled to see Jake Thornton standing there, a bouquet of flowers in his hand and that cocky grin on his face. He was dressed in an expensive suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary. "Mr. Thornton," I said, feeling my cheeks warm. "What are you doing here? Is everything all right with your arm?" He chuckled. "Please, call me Jake. And my arm's fine, thanks to your excellent care. These are for you, by the way." He handed me the flowers. I accepted them awkwardly, aware of my coworkers' curious stares. "Thank you, but why?" "Because I'm asking you out on a date," he said bluntly. "And I'm hoping these might persuade you to say yes." Against my better judgment, I found myself nodding. "Okay, one dinner. But that's it." Jake's face lit up. "Great. I'll pick you up at 8. Wear something nice." As he strode out of the hospital, leaving me standing there with a bouquet of expensive flowers, I couldn't help but wonder what I'd just gotten myself into. That night, I agonized over what to wear. My closet was full of practical clothes for work, nothing suitable for a date with someone like Jake Thornton. I finally settled on a simple black dress, the only one I owned. At 8 o'clock sharp, a sleek black car pulled up outside my modest apartment building. Jake stepped out, looking like he'd just walked off a magazine cover in his tailored suit. "You look beautiful," he said, his eyes appreciative as he opened the car door for me. The restaurant he took me to was the kind of place I'd only ever seen in movies. Crystal chandeliers, soft piano music, waiters in tuxedos, it was all so overwhelming. "Relax," Jake said, noticing my discomfort. "It's just dinner." But it wasn't just dinner. It was the beginning of something I never could have anticipated. As we talked, I discovered that beneath his cocky exterior, Jake was intelligent, funny, and surprisingly down-to-earth. He told me about his work as a financial director in his father's company, and I found myself sharing stories about my life and my passion for nursing. "You know," Jake said as we were finishing dessert, "I've dated a lot of women, but I've never met anyone quite like you, Irene." I laughed. "I'm sure you say that to all the girls." "No," he said, his tone serious. "I mean it. You're real. Genuine. It's refreshing." As he drove me home that night, I realized that I was in dangerous territory. But when he kissed me goodnight, soft and sweet, all my reservations melted away. And as I watched his car disappear into the night, I knew that my life was never going to be the same again. The weeks that followed were like a dream. Jake and I started dating regularly, and I found myself falling harder for him with each passing day. But reality had a way of intruding on our fairy tale. The first time Jake took me to meet his parents, I knew immediately that they disapproved of me. "So, Irene," Jake's mother, Elizabeth Thornton, said coolly, "Jake tells us you're a nurse?" I nodded, trying to hide my nervousness. "Yes, at City General." "How quaint," she replied, her tone making it clear she thought it was anything but. Jake's father, Richard, barely looked up from his newspaper. "And your family? What do they do?" "My father's a retired police officer, and my mother's a teacher," I said proudly. Elizabeth exchanged a look with her husband that spoke volumes. It was clear they thought I wasn't good enough for their son. As we left that night, Jake squeezed my hand reassuringly. "Don't worry about them," he said. "They'll come around eventually." But I wasn't so sure. The disapproval of Jake's parents cast a shadow over our relationship, one that I couldn't quite shake. Despite this, Jake and I grew closer. He showered me with affection and gifts, taking me to places I'd only ever dreamed of. But I never felt comfortable in his world of wealth and privilege. I was always acutely aware of how different we were. One night, after a particularly lavish date, I confronted Jake about it. "Why me?" I asked. "You could have any woman you want. Someone from your world. Why choose a simple nurse?" Jake cupped my face in his hands. "Because you're real, Irene. You're not with me for my money or my name. You see me for who I really am." His words touched me deeply, and I pushed my doubts aside. I loved Jake, and he loved me. Wasn't that all that mattered? 6 months into our relationship, Jake proposed. It wasn't a grand, elaborate affair, just the two of us, on the rooftop of my apartment building under the stars. It was perfect. We decided on a simple ceremony, much to the dismay of Jake's parents. But Jake stood firm, insisting that it was our day, not theirs. As I walked down the aisle, seeing Jake's beaming face, I felt like my heart might burst with happiness. This was the beginning of our forever. After the wedding, we moved into Jake's luxury apartment. It was bigger than any place I'd ever lived, with a view of the city that took my breath away. "Welcome home, Mrs. Thornton," Jake said, scooping me up in his arms as we crossed the threshold. I giggled, still not used to my new name. "I love you, Mr. Thornton." Married life with Jake started off beautifully. We settled into a routine in our luxurious apartment, and I continued working part-time at the hospital. A few months after our wedding, I discovered I was pregnant. Jake was overjoyed when I told him the news. "We're going to be parents," he exclaimed, spinning me around in our living room. "I can't wait to meet our little one." The pregnancy was relatively easy, and 9 months later, I gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. We named her Lily. Jake was by my side throughout the delivery, holding my hand and encouraging me. To my surprise, Jake's parents seemed to soften a bit after Lily was born. They doted on their granddaughter, showering her with gifts and attention. However, their attitude towards me remained cool and distant. "At least you managed to give Jake an heir," Elizabeth said during one of their visits, her tone a mix of approval and condescension. I bit my tongue, reminding myself that Lily deserved to have a relationship with her grandparents, regardless of how they treated me. As the months passed, I noticed subtle changes in Jake. He started working longer hours at his father's company, often coming home late and exhausted. Our conversations became shorter, more superficial. He'd ask me to prepare his suits and shine his shoes, but rarely inquired about my day or how I was feeling. One evening, as I was putting Lily to bed, Jake came home later than usual. "Where have you been?" I asked, trying to keep the accusation out of my voice. "Working late," he replied tersely. "There's a big merger coming up. I need to be prepared." I nodded, unconvinced. "I made dinner. It's in the fridge if you want to heat it up." Jake waved his hand dismissively. "I already ate at the office." This became our new normal. Jake would come home late, barely acknowledge me or Lily, and retreat to his home office. I tried to talk to him about it, but he always had an excuse. "I'm doing this for us, Irene," he'd say. "For our future. You wouldn't understand the pressure I'm under." I felt a growing distance between us, a chasm I didn't know how to bridge. The man I married, the one who had swept me off my feet, seemed to be disappearing before my eyes. One day, I received an unexpected call from Elizabeth, Jake's mother. "Irene," she said, her voice cold and disapproving. "I hope you realize you're not fulfilling your duties as the wife of a financial director." Confused and hurt, I asked, "What do you mean?" "You didn't even bother to come to the corporate party last night," she replied. "Though perhaps it's for the best. You would have stood out among the gorgeous women there, and not in a good way." My heart sank. I hadn't known about any corporate party. Jake hadn't mentioned it to me. That evening, when Jake came home, I confronted him. "Why didn't you invite me to the corporate party?" Jake's face hardened. "Irene, let's be honest. You're too simple for those events. I'd be embarrassed to have you there." His words cut deep, confirming my worst fears. The man I loved, the one who had once called me real and genuine, now found me embarrassing. The weeks following Jake's cruel words were tense. We barely spoke. I threw myself into caring for Lily and my work at the hospital, trying to ignore the growing pit in my stomach. One evening, Jake called to say he was staying late at work again. I decided to use the quiet time to clean up a bit. As I tidied his home office, I noticed his computer was on, the screen glowing softly in the dim room. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the mouse. I knew I shouldn't, but something compelled me to look. To my surprise, the computer wasn't password protected. With a shaky hand, I opened his email. What I found shattered my world. There, in black and white, was an email exchange between Jake and a woman named Vanessa. As I read through their correspondence, my heart pounded in my chest. They weren't just co-workers, they were lovers. They mocked me, calling me a hen, a fool, a redneck without taste. Jake praised Vanessa's skills in bed, while dismissing me as dull and unattractive. With trembling hands, I copied all the correspondence I could find onto a USB drive. I needed proof, something concrete to confront Jake with. I barely slept that night, tossing and turning as Jake's words echoed in my mind. When he finally came home the next morning, I was waiting for him in the living room, Lily asleep in her crib. "We need to talk," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I know about Vanessa." His face paled for a moment, before a smirk settled on his lips. "Come on, Irene. Did you really think someone like me would be satisfied with someone like you? Vanessa is everything you're not: beautiful, sophisticated, amazing in bed." Each word was like a knife to my heart. "I'm your wife," I whispered. "The mother of your child. And that's all you'll ever be," he sneered. "I'm not giving up Vanessa. You'll just have to deal with it." In that moment, something inside me snapped. No, I said firmly. I won't deal with it. This marriage is over, Jake. His smirk faltered. You can't leave me. You have nowhere to go, no money of your own. I'd rather be poor and alone than stay with a cheating bastard like you, I spat. I rushed to Lily's room, scooped her up, and grabbed the pre-packed bag I'd prepared earlier. As I headed for the door, Jake called out. You'll regret this, Irene. I'll make sure of it. I turned to face him one last time. No, Jake. You're the one who's going to regret this. With those words, I walked out of our luxury apartment, my daughter in my arms and my heart in pieces. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain: I was done being Jake Thornton's fool. The taxi pulled up to my parents' modest home, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. My mother opened the door before I could even knock, concern etched on her face. Irene, what's wrong, sweetheart? She asked, taking in my tear-stained face and Lily in my arms. Mom, I choked out. Jake, he's been cheating on me. My father appeared behind her, his expression hardening. That bastard, he muttered, ushering us inside. Over the next few hours, I poured out the whole sordid story to my parents. They were furious but supportive, insisting that Lily and I stay with them as long as we needed. But Jake wasn't content with just ending our marriage. He wanted to destroy me completely. I was served with court papers. He was suing for full custody of Lily, claiming I was an unfit mother. The allegations in the lawsuit made me sick. Jake painted me as unstable, neglectful, an alcoholic who cheated on him. Every word was a lie, but I knew how powerful the Thorntons were. My saving grace came in the form of the USB drive I'd taken from Jake's computer. In court, his smug expression faltered as my lawyer presented the evidence. The judge, a no-nonsense woman, saw right through his lies. In the end, I was granted primary custody of Lily, with Jake ordered to pay a hefty amount in child support and alimony. I thought that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. A few weeks later, as I was settling into life at my parents' house, a sleek car pulled up outside. Jake stepped out, followed by a stunning woman I assumed was Vanessa. I'm here to see my daughter, Jake demanded as I opened the door. Before I could respond, Vanessa pushed past me into the house. Her nose wrinkled as she looked around. My God, Jake, she said loudly, this place is like a homeless shelter. And these old people? They're practically worthless. I saw red. How dare she insult my parents, who had welcomed me with open arms when I had nowhere else to go? Get out, I hissed, my voice shaking with rage. Both of you, get out of my house right now. Jake's face twisted with anger. You can't keep me from my child, Irene. I'll take her from you, just wait and see. As I slammed the door in their faces, I knew this wasn't over. Jake and Vanessa wouldn't stop until they'd taken everything from me. I needed to fight back. That night, I called my father's old police buddy, now a private investigator, named Frank. I need dirt on Jake and his new girlfriend, I told him. Anything you can find. Frank's investigation yielded more than I could have imagined. Vanessa, it turned out, had a colorful past as an escort, living off rich men's money. But that wasn't all. She was currently embezzling from Jake's company and selling insider information to their competitors. Even more shocking, Frank uncovered evidence that Jake himself was far from innocent. He'd been siphoning money from the company into offshore accounts for years. I had the power to bring Jake and Vanessa's world crashing down around them. But I wouldn't act rashly. No, I would bide my time, waiting for the perfect moment to unleash this information for maximum impact. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when my phone rang. I was surprised to see Elizabeth Thornton's name on the caller ID. With some trepidation, I answered. Irene, Elizabeth's cold voice, came through the speaker. My birthday is next weekend. I expect Lily to be there. You may accompany her if you must. Before I could respond, she hung up. I stood there, phone in hand, a plan forming in my mind. This was the opportunity I'd been waiting for. As we approached the Thornton mansion, I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. Richard answered the door, his face a mask of polite indifference. "Ah, Irene. And little Lily, come in." The room was filled with the Thorntons' high society friends, all giving me curious looks. I felt like a specimen under a microscope. Suddenly, the room fell silent as Jake entered, Vanessa on his arm. His face registered surprise at seeing me, quickly masked by a smug smile. "Everyone," he announced, "I'd like you to meet Vanessa, my fiancée and future wife." The room erupted in congratulations. Elizabeth and Richard fawned over Vanessa, showering her with compliments. "Oh, Jake," Elizabeth gushed, "Vanessa is simply wonderful. Such impeccable breeding and education. A much better match for you than, well." She glanced dismissively in my direction. I felt my cheeks burn with humiliation and anger. But now was not the time to lose control. I waited until the excitement died down, then slowly stood up. "I have something to say," I announced, my voice steady, despite my racing heart. I pulled out the folder from my purse and turned to address the room. "You all seem very impressed with Vanessa. But do you know who she really is?" The room fell silent as I began to reveal the truth. I explained how Vanessa was living under a false identity, how she had no real education, and how she had worked as an escort, sleeping with rich men for money. Gasps and murmurs filled the room. Vanessa's face had gone pale, while Jake looked like he might be sick. But I wasn't finished. "And that's not all," I continued. "Vanessa has been selling company secrets to your competitors. She's been embezzling money from the company accounts Jake so trustingly gave her access to." Richard Thornton's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "Is this true?" he thundered, turning to Jake and Vanessa. Before either could respond, I delivered the final blow. "And Jake? Jake has been transferring company funds to offshore accounts for years." The room erupted into chaos. Richard grabbed Vanessa by the arm, practically dragging her to the door. "Get out of my house, you deceitful witch," he roared. "I'll see you in court for this." He then rounded on Jake, his hand connecting with Jake's face in a resounding slap. "You're fired, you ungrateful scoundrel. How dare you steal from your own family?" In the midst of the pandemonium, I calmly picked up Lily and headed for the door. As I passed Jake, who was holding his reddened cheek, I paused. "I told you you'd regret this, Jake," I said softly. "Goodbye." In the weeks following the explosive revelation at Elizabeth's birthday party, my life took yet another unexpected turn. One afternoon, I received a call from Richard Thornton. "Irene," he said, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "Elizabeth and we'd like to speak with you. In person, if possible." Curious and slightly apprehensive, I agreed to meet them at a quiet cafe the next day. As I walked in, I saw them sitting at a corner table, looking older and more subdued than I'd ever seen them. "Irene," Elizabeth began as I sat down, "we owe you an apology. A big one." Richard nodded solemnly. "We misjudged you terribly. You saved our company, our reputation. We can never thank you enough." Over the next hour, we talked more openly than we ever had before. They shared their regrets, their shock at Jake's betrayal, and their hope for a fresh start. By the time we left the cafe, a tentative peace had been established between us. Life continued to evolve rapidly. Vanessa was arrested for fraud and embezzlement, facing not just a hefty fine, but potential jail time. Jake, stripped of his position and his fancy apartment by his parents, left the state in disgrace. He would call occasionally to speak with Lily, but our interactions remained cold and distant. One day, Richard and Elizabeth invited me to their office. "We have something for you," Richard said, handing me an envelope. Inside was the deed to a small but lovely apartment in a nice part of town. "It's yours," Elizabeth explained. "A thank you for saving the company. And a new start for you and Lily." I was overwhelmed by their generosity. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll accept it," Richard said warmly. "And there's more. We'd like to pay for your education." You mentioned once that you dreamed of becoming a doctor? Tears welled up in my eyes. A cardiologist, actually. But I never thought. Now you can, Elizabeth smiled. Consider it an investment in our granddaughter's future. And so, at 30 years old, I found myself embarking on a new journey. Balancing single motherhood with medical school was challenging, but I was determined to succeed. Lily and I settled into our new apartment, building a life that was entirely our own. I never thought I'd be starting over at 35, but here I am, Dr. Tessa Thompson, dentist and soon-to-be business owner. It's been 3 years since I married Mike, a mechanical engineer, 5 years my senior. We live in my apartment. He says he left his to his ex-wife after their divorce. I don't know much about that part of his life, and I've never pushed. Our life together has been good, for the most part. I make a comfortable living as a dentist, but I've always dreamed of more. That's why I've been squirreling away every extra penny, denying myself little luxuries. My goal? Opening my own private practice. You should do it, Tessa, Mike said one evening as we sat on our worn couch, the TV droning in the background. You'd be great at running your own business. I looked at him, surprised by his enthusiasm. You really think so? He nodded, taking a swig of his beer. Absolutely. My wife, the business owner. Has a nice ring to it, don't you think? I couldn't help but smile. It did sound nice. It'll be a lot of work, I warned him. And money. We'll have to tighten our belts for a while. Mike waved his hand dismissively. Don't worry about that. We'll make it work. I'll support us for the first year while you get things up and running. You just focus on making your dream come true. His words filled me with warmth. This was why I loved him, his unwavering support, his belief in me. Okay, I said, my mind already racing with plans. Let's do this. The next few months were a whirlwind. I quit my job at the clinic, throwing myself headfirst into preparations. There was so much to do, getting licenses, finding the right location, renovations, equipment. Every day brought new challenges, new decisions to make. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime of preparation, my office was ready. I stood in the doorway, taking in the gleaming equipment, the fresh paint smell, the neatly arranged waiting area. This was mine. All mine. As I locked up that first night, a mix of excitement and terror churned in my stomach. Tomorrow, I'd open my doors to my first patients. I was on my own now, sink or swim. The first few months of running my own dental practice were a whirlwind. I worked 7 days a week, from dawn till dusk, barely stopping to eat or sleep. My office became my second home, scratch that, my first home. I saw more of my dental chair than I did of my own bed. Dr. Thompson, your next patient is ready, my receptionist, Lisa, would say, poking her head into my office. I'd nod, gulping down the last of my cold coffee. Thanks, Lisa. Send them in. And so it went, day after day. Fillings, crowns, root canals, I did it all. When I wasn't with patients, I was buried in paperwork, learning the ins and outs of running a business. It was exhausting, but exhilarating too. This was my dream, after all. Mike and I became like ships passing in the night. When I left for work, he was still asleep. When I got home, he was already in bed. We communicated through hastily scribbled notes and brief text messages. How's work? I texted one day, during a rare quiet moment. Fine, came the reply, hours later. I frowned at my phone. That was it? Just fine? But before I could dwell on it, Lisa was calling me for another patient, and thoughts of Mike were pushed to the back of my mind. Weeks turned into months. I was so focused on my practice that I barely noticed the changing seasons. Spring became summer, summer faded into fall. I was making progress, slowly but surely. My patient list was growing, and I was starting to see some regulars. You're doing great, Dr. Thompson, Mr. Johnson, one of my first patients, said during a checkup. This place is really coming along. I beamed at him. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. That means a lot. But for every high, there was a low. The stress was constant, the pressure immense. There were nights I'd come home and cry, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. But then I'd think of how far I'd come, how much I'd invested, and I'd pull myself together. I couldn't give up now. One particularly grueling day, I stumbled home well past midnight. The apartment was dark and quiet. I kicked off my shoes and collapsed onto the couch, too tired to make it to the bedroom. That's when my phone rang. I groaned, fumbling for it in the dark. Who could be calling at this hour? Tessa, is that you? It was Mike's mother, Ellen, her voice tight with worry. I sat up, suddenly alert. Yes, it's me. What's wrong? I've been trying to reach Mike all day, Ellen said. He's not answering his phone. I'm worried sick. There's been some kind of scandal at his work. My heart dropped. Scandal? What scandal? I'm sorry, I don't know anything about this, I said, my mind racing. I haven't really talked to Mike in a while. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Oh, Mike's mother said, her voice small. I see. Well, if you hear from him, please ask him to call me. Of course, I promised. I'll talk to him as soon as I can. After we hung up, I sat in the dark, my exhaustion forgotten. What was going on with Mike? How could there be a scandal at his work that I knew nothing about? I found Mike in our bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed with his head in his hands. He looked up when I entered, his eyes red-rimmed and tired. We need to talk, I said, my voice sounding strangely calm, despite the turmoil inside me. Your mom called. She said there was some kind of scandal at your work. What's going on, Mike? He let out a long, shaky breath. I quit my job, Tessa. About a month ago. The words hit me like a physical blow. A month? You've been unemployed for a month and you didn't tell me? I didn't want to upset you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You've been so busy with the practice, I didn't want to add to your stress. I stood up, pacing the room as I tried to process this information. So what happened? Your mom mentioned a scandal. Mike ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd seen 1,000 times when he was uncomfortable. I had a fight with my boss. He was being unreasonable, demanding more and more overtime without compensation. I stood up to him, things got heated, and I walked out. My pride wouldn't let me stay. I wanted to yell, to shake him, to demand why he thought his pride was more important than our financial stability. But looking at him, slumped and defeated, I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I sat back down beside him. What are you going to do now? I asked softly. Mike shrugged. I don't know. I think I might be suffering from burnout. I'd been thinking about seeing a psychologist, maybe taking a short break from work to figure things out. Part of me wanted to scream that we couldn't afford a break, that I was already working myself to the bone trying to keep my new practice afloat. But I swallowed those words. Mike needed support, not criticism. Okay, I said, taking his hand. If that's what you need, we'll make it work. But Mike, you have to promise me something. No more secrets. I need to know what's going on in your life, good or bad. Okay? Mike nodded, squeezing my hand. Okay, I promise. I'm sorry, Tessa. I should have told you sooner. The next day, I called the clinic where I used to work and asked if they had any part-time positions available. It was a step backward, but we needed the extra income. As I hung up the phone, having secured the part-time position, I looked at Mike. He was on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. I got the job, I said. I start next week. He just nodded in response, as if it was something that was taken for granted. The next few months were a blur of exhaustion and stress. I'd wake up at dawn, see patients at my office until early afternoon, then rush to the clinic for my part-time shift. By the time I got home each night, I was dead on my feet. Mike, true to his word, started seeing a psychologist. He talked about burnout and needing time to recuperate. I tried to be supportive, but it was hard not to feel resentful as I watched him lounging on the couch while I worked myself to the bone. One evening, about 3 months after Mike had quit his job, I came home to find him in an unusually good mood. "Tessa," he exclaimed as I trudged through the door. "I've got great news. I got a job. It's with that engineering firm downtown. I start next week." Relief washed over me. Finally, things were looking up. "That's wonderful, Mike," I said, managing a tired smile. "We should celebrate." And celebrate we did. I splurged on a bottle of wine, and for the first time in months, we sat down to a meal together, talking and laughing like we used to. It felt good, like maybe we were getting back on track. But my relief was short-lived. A month into his new job, Mike came home fuming. "I quit," he announced, throwing his briefcase onto the couch. I froze, the plate I was washing slipping from my hands and clattering into the sink. "What? Why?" "The boss is a tyrant," Mike spat. "He wants complete control over everything. I'm not some puppet he can order around." "So what now?" I asked when he finally paused for breath. He shrugged. "I'll find something else. Something better. A job where they appreciate my skills and give me the freedom I deserve." I wanted to scream. To shake him and ask if he appreciated my skills, if he understood the freedom I'd given up to keep us afloat. But I didn't. I just nodded, turned back to the dishes, and tried to ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach. The weeks that followed were tense. Mike spent his days at home, supposedly job hunting, while I continued my grueling schedule. But more and more often, I'd come home to find him playing video games or watching TV. "Any luck with the job search?" I'd ask. "Nothing suitable yet," he'd reply, not looking away from the screen. "These companies just don't get it. I need something challenging, you know? With good pay and flexible hours." Then one day, Mike started talking about having children. "Wouldn't it be great to have a little one running around?" he said over breakfast. "I could stay home and take care of the kid while you work. It's the perfect solution." I stared at him, my coffee mug frozen halfway to my lips. "Mike, we can barely afford our current lifestyle. How could we possibly support a child?" He waved his hand dismissively. "We'll figure it out. You're doing great with your practice, and I'll find something eventually. Come on, Tessa, don't you want to be a mom?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. Of course I wanted children, someday. But not like this. Not when our marriage was hanging by a thread and our financial situation was so precarious. "I think we need to focus on getting our lives in order first," I said carefully. "Maybe when things are more stable." Mike's face fell. "You just don't understand," he muttered. "You're always so focused on work, you can't see what's really important." His words stung, but I didn't have the energy to argue. I just got up, rinsed my mug, and headed out to another long day of work. As the months dragged on, the tension in our household grew thicker. Mike's job search had become sporadic at best, and he spent more and more time immersed in his video games. I was exhausted, stressed, and increasingly resentful. One evening, I came home to find Mike excitedly setting up a new gaming console. "What's this?" I asked, my voice tight. He grinned, not noticing my tone. "Just got the latest system. The graphics are incredible." I felt my temper flare. "And how exactly did you pay for this?" Mike's smile faltered. I took some money from our joint account. But don't worry, it's an investment in my hobby. Once I start working again, I'll pay it all back." The argument that followed was ugly. Months of pent-up frustration and resentment came pouring out. We said things we couldn't take back, reopened old wounds, and created new ones. From that day on, I stopped putting money into our joint account. I paid the bills myself and bought groceries as needed. Mike was furious, accusing me of not respecting him and infringing on his rights. "I'm the man of this house," he yelled during one particularly heated argument. "I should be managing our finances." I laughed bitterly. "What finances, Mike? The money I earned that you spend on games and beer?" The atmosphere at home became unbearable. We barely spoke, and when we did, it usually ended in an argument. I threw myself into my work even more, using it as an escape from the disaster my personal life had become. Then came the day that changed everything. I was at home, catching up on some paperwork, when I overheard Mike on the phone with his parents. His voice drifted from the bedroom, animated in a way I hadn't heard in months. "Yeah, I need a new business suit for this job interview," he was saying. "It's a great opportunity, but I'm a little short on cash right now. Could you maybe help me out?" I felt a spark of hope. Was Mike finally taking his job search seriously? But as I listened, that hope quickly turned to ash. "Thanks, Mom. I really appreciate it. I'll pay you back as soon as I get the job." The call ended, and I waited, expecting Mike to come share the news about his interview. But he didn't. Instead, I heard the familiar sounds of him booting up his computer. Curious and increasingly suspicious, I quietly made my way to the bedroom door. What I saw made my blood run cold. Mike was online, not browsing job listings, but purchasing a new computer game and ordering a case of beer for delivery. I couldn't believe my eyes. He had just lied to his parents, begged them for money under false pretenses, and now he was spending it on alcohol and games? "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I demanded, pushing the door open. Mike jumped, guilt flashing across his face, before quickly being replaced by defiance. "It's none of your business. This is my money." "Your money?" I was incredulous. "You just lied to your parents to get that money. They think you're buying a suit for a job interview." The argument that followed was the worst we'd ever had. Finally, red-faced and shaking with anger, Mike grabbed a bag and started throwing clothes into it. "Where are you going?" I asked, my voice hoarse from yelling. "To my parents," he spat. "At least they support me." As the door slammed behind him, I sank to the floor, overwhelmed by a mix of anger, disappointment, and an odd sense of relief. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt like I could breathe. Days passed since Mike stormed out, and the apartment felt eerily quiet without him. On the fourth day, as I was finishing up with a patient, my phone buzzed. Mike's name flashed on the screen. My heart raced as I answered. "Hey, Tessa." Mike's voice was cheerful, as if nothing had happened. "I'm in Miami with my parents. Mom's always wanted to come here, so we decided to make a weekend of it." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "And how exactly are you paying for this trip?" There was a brief pause before Mike answered, his tone slightly less jovial. "Well, I had to borrow a couple of your credit cards. But don't worry. I'll pay you back many times over once I start this new job." I felt sick. "You took my credit cards without asking me?" "Come on, don't be like that," Mike said, his voice taking on that wheedling tone I'd grown to hate. "It's just for the weekend. I'll bring you back a nice shell from the beach, okay? Have a good weekend, honey." Before I could respond, he had hung up. In that moment, something inside me snapped. With shaking hands, I opened my banking app and blocked all my credit cards. Next, I called a locksmith. Within an hour, he was at my apartment, changing the locks. My final stop that day was a lawyer's office. I'd found her online, Sandra Patel, specializing in divorce law. "I want to file for divorce," I said, the words coming out easier than I'd expected. Sandra nodded, her expression compassionate but professional. "I understand, Dr. Thompson. We'll start the process right away. Can you tell me a bit more about your situation?" By the time I left her office, the divorce papers were being drawn up. As I stepped out onto the street, the late afternoon sun warming my face, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. The sun had long set when my phone rang again. Mike's name flashed on the screen, and I braced myself as I answered. Tessa? Thank God you picked up. Mike's voice was frantic. Something's wrong with the credit cards. They're not working, and we can't pay for anything here. Mom and Dad are freaking out. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. That's because I blocked them, Mike. I didn't give you permission to use my cards. There was stunned silence for a moment before Mike spoke again. Look, I'm sorry, okay? His tone shifted to pleading. We're already here on the coast. Can't you just unblock the cards? We'll sort everything out when we get back, I promise. I almost laughed at the familiarity of those empty promises. No, Mike. I'm done sorting things out for you. You've put me in impossible situations time and time again. Now you can figure this one out on your own. Tessa, please. He was begging now. You're putting me in such an awkward position. My parents are here, we have no way to pay, this is your problem too. No, Mike, I said firmly. This is your problem. You created it, now you solve it. Goodbye. The next day, I took a personal day from work. I spent the morning packing up Mike's belongings, trying not to get caught up in memories as I boxed up his clothes, books, and the various gadgets he'd accumulated over the years. Once everything was packed, I called a storage facility and arranged for his things to be kept there. A few days later, I was at work when my phone buzzed with a call from Mike. I stepped out of my office to take it. Tessa? I'm outside the apartment, but my key isn't working. Did you change the locks? He sounded incredulous. Yes, I did, I replied calmly. Mike, I've sent divorce papers to your parents' address. You should be receiving them soon. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Divorce papers? Tessa, you can't be serious. We can work this out, we always do. Not this time, I said, surprised at how steady my voice was. I packed up your things and sent them to a storage facility. I'll text you the details. Tessa, please, he begged. Let's start over. I'll change, I promise. Just give me one more chance. I closed my eyes, memories of all the last chances flashing through my mind. No, Mike. It's over. I hope you find what you're looking for, but it won't be with me. As I hung up the phone, I felt a mix of emotions, sadness for the end of what we once had, relief that it was finally over, and a growing excitement for what the future might hold. For the first time in years, that future was entirely up to me. A few weeks after I'd sent Mike's belongings to storage, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I answered cautiously. Tessa? It's Ellen, Mike's mother. I braced myself, expecting a tirade about ruining their Miami trip. But Ellen's voice was soft, almost apologetic. I owe you an apology, Tessa, she said, catching me off guard. I had no idea what Mike has been putting you through. As Ellen spoke, the pieces of Mike's past began to fall into place. She told me about Mike's first wife, how she'd left him due to his chronic irresponsibility. Ellen had hoped Mike had changed, that our marriage would be different. When we got back from Miami and I learned the truth, how he'd been lying to you, stealing your money, I was devastated, Ellen confessed. I kicked him out of the house. I couldn't enable his behavior anymore. I felt a wave of empathy for this woman who'd raised Mike, who'd hoped for the best for her son. It's not your fault, Ellen, I said softly. You didn't know. Still, I'm so sorry for what he's put you through, she replied. You didn't deserve any of it. After we hung up, I sat in silence, processing the conversation. It was oddly comforting to know that I wasn't alone in being disappointed by Mike. In the weeks that followed, Mike made several attempts to reconcile. He showed up at my office, flowers in hand, pleading for another chance. He waited outside my apartment, trying to catch me as I came home. Each time, I refused to engage. I knew now that he wouldn't change, that we'd end up in the same cycle if I let him back in. As time passed, I found myself settling into a new rhythm. Without Mike's expenses draining our accounts, I was able to focus fully on my practice. I left the part-time clinic job, pouring all my energy into my own office. I hired a marketing consultant, and soon my patient list was growing steadily. 6 months after filing for divorce, I hired 2 more dentists to help with the increased workload. It was a joy to see my little practice flourishing, to know that all my hard work was finally paying off. A year after Mike left, I made the final payment on my business loan. To celebrate, I booked a weekend trip to a nearby spa resort. Something I'd always wanted to do but had never allowed myself to splurge on before. As I lounged by the pool, sipping a fruity cocktail, I marveled at how much my life had changed. Now, as I sit in my expanded office, looking over plans for a new wing to accommodate more specialists, I can't help but feel proud of how far I've come. The past 2 years have been a journey of self-discovery and growth. I've learned to value myself, to trust my instincts, and to never settle for less than I deserve. Who knows what the future might bring? For now, I'm content knowing that whatever comes next, I have the strength and wisdom to handle it. My story isn't over. In many ways, it feels like it's just beginning. My name is Amanda, and this is the story of how I survived growing up with a sister who could have given Machiavelli a run for his money. I was born in a small town to ordinary working-class parents. Mom was a receptionist at a local dentist's office, and Dad worked as a mechanic. They were good people, hardworking and honest, but perhaps a bit too trusting for their own good. When I came into the world, it was a difficult birth. The doctors told my mom she wouldn't be able to have any more children. So, for 5 years, I was their miracle baby, their only child. Those first 5 years were nice, normal. I have vague memories of picnics in the park, of Dad teaching me to ride a bike, of Mom reading me bedtime stories. But it all changed when I was 5, and my parents got the shock of their lives. Mom was pregnant again. I remember the day they told me I was going to be a big sister. They were practically glowing with excitement, and I caught their enthusiasm. I imagined having a little sister to play with, to share secrets with, to be best friends with. God, I was so naive. Sarah was born when I was 5.5. From the moment she came home from the hospital, it was like a switch had been flipped. Suddenly, I wasn't the miracle child anymore. Amanda, be quiet. Your sister's sleeping. Amanda, don't touch that. It's for your sister. Amanda, why can't you be more like your sister? It started small, you know? Little things that I brushed off as normal sibling stuff. But as Sarah grew, so did her talents. I remember her 7th birthday. Mom had spent hours on this beautiful cake, covered in delicate sugar roses. It was a work of art. The guests had just arrived when we heard Mom's horrified gasp from the kitchen. The cake was ruined, the roses all but destroyed. And there was Sarah, pointing at me with an accusing finger. Amanda did it, she said, her voice trembling in a way that adults find impossible to disbelieve. I saw her. I stood there, stunned, as Sarah produced my favorite t-shirt, now smeared with cake and frosting. I don't know how she got it, how she planned it all. She was 7, but she had the cunning of someone much older. I spent the rest of the party locked in my bedroom, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter and celebration downstairs. As the sun set and the house quieted, I heard my door creak open. Sarah stood there, a slice of cake in her hand and a smile on her face that sent chills down my spine. Want some cake, big sister? She whispered, her eyes glittering in the dim light. I saved you a piece. With a rose and everything. I stared at her, this young demon in a party dress, and felt the first stirrings of real fear. What kind of 7-year-old could pull off something like this? And more importantly, what else was she capable of? As the years rolled by, Sarah's manipulation tactics only grew more sophisticated. Every day became a new battle, and I was constantly on edge, wondering what she'd do next. When I was 14 and Sarah was 9, I started to notice my school supplies going missing or getting damaged. At first, I thought I was just being careless, misplacing things here and there. But then I started finding my notebooks with pages torn out, pencils broken in half, and textbooks with scribbles all over the important parts. One day, I caught Sarah red-handed, a pair of scissors in her hand and my history essay in shreds on her bedroom floor. "What are you doing?" I yelled, snatching the remains of my homework from her. Sarah's eyes welled up with crocodile tears. I was just trying to help you cut out some pictures for your project," she sniffled. "This isn't a project, it's my essay. It's due tomorrow." But it was too late. Mom had heard the commotion and came running. "What's going on here?" Before I could explain, Sarah burst into full-blown sobs. "I was just trying to help Amanda with her homework, but she yelled at me." Mom turned to me, her face a mask of disappointment. "Amanda, how could you? Your sister was only trying to help. Apologize to your sister right now." I stood there, seething with anger and frustration. Sarah peeked at me from behind Mom's legs, a sly smile playing on her lips. "I'm sorry," I gritted out, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. That night, I had to stay up until 3 a.m. rewriting my essay. The next day at school, I could barely keep my eyes open. My teacher wasn't impressed with my sloppy handwriting and obvious fatigue. "Amanda, this isn't like you," she said, frowning at my paper. "Please put more effort into your schoolwork. I'd hate to have to call your parents." But of course, she did end up calling my parents. And of course, they blamed me for not being responsible enough, for not taking my studies seriously. Sarah sat at the dinner table, quietly eating her food with a satisfied smirk, as Mom and Dad lectured me about the importance of education. As I grew older, Sarah's tactics evolved. When I started showing interest in boys in high school, she found new ways to torment me. My first boyfriend, Jake, broke up with me after hearing a rumor that I'd been cheating on him with his best friend. I was devastated, but when I confronted Sarah about it, she just shrugged. "How could I have started that rumor?" she said innocently. "I don't even know your friends from school." But I saw the glint in her eye, the barely concealed satisfaction at my pain. She was getting better at covering her tracks, at maintaining her facade of innocence. As my high school years progressed, I became more determined than ever to secure my escape. I poured all my energy into a special project that I hoped would be my ticket to a prestigious college far away from Sarah's clutches. But I knew better than to let my guard down, even for a moment. My friend Melissa was the only person I truly trusted. We'd been close since elementary school, and she was well aware of Sarah's true nature. "I need you to keep something for me," I told her one afternoon as we sat in her room. I pulled out a thick folder from my backpack. "This is my project for the university grant competition. If I win, I get a full ride to Westfield College." "Wow, that's amazing," Melissa exclaimed, then her face fell slightly. "But, why are you giving it to me?" I took a deep breath. "Because if Sarah finds out how important this is to me, she'll find a way to destroy it. I need you to keep it safe. I'll work on a dummy version at home." Melissa's eyes widened in understanding. "Clever," she said, taking the folder and locking it in her desk drawer. "Don't worry, I'll guard it with my life." For weeks, I worked on 2 versions of the project, the real one, safely tucked away at Melissa's house, and a decoy version at home. I made sure to leave the decoy version conspicuously on my desk, knowing Sarah wouldn't be able to resist snooping. The day before the submission deadline, it happened. I was in the kitchen when I heard Sarah's sickeningly sweet voice. "Oh no, Amanda, I'm so sorry." I rushed to the living room to find Sarah standing over my desk, a glass of orange juice appended over my decoy project. Papers were soaked, ink running in streaks across the pages. "I was just bringing you a drink," Sarah said, her eyes wide with feigned innocence. I tripped. It was an accident, I swear. Our parents came running at the commotion. Mom gasped at the sight of the ruined papers. "Oh, Amanda," she sighed. "You should be more careful about where you leave important things." I saw the glint of triumph in Sarah's eyes, the slight upturn of her lips as she waited for my reaction. But this time I was ready. I smiled. The look of confusion on Sarah's face was almost comical. "It's okay," I said calmly. "That was just a backup copy. I already submitted the real project last week." The triumph in Sarah's eyes flickered and died, replaced by a flash of anger so quick I almost missed it. Our parents, oblivious as always, praised me for my foresight. A few weeks later, the results of the competition were announced. I'd won the grant, a full scholarship to Westfield College, 3 states away. As I read the acceptance letter, tears of joy and relief streamed down my face. I was getting out. I was finally escaping. But my moment of triumph was short-lived. As I packed my bags for college, I overheard my parents talking in hushed tones. "It's a shame," Mom was saying. "I wish Sarah had gotten an opportunity like this. She deserves it more." "I know," Dad agreed. "Amanda's smart, but Sarah, she's special. She could really go places with a chance like that." Their words stung, but I was past caring. In a few days, I'd be gone, starting a new life far away from Sarah's manipulations and my parents' blind favoritism. The next few years were like a breath of fresh air. At Westfield College, I thrived. I made genuine friends, excelled in my studies, and even started to heal from the emotional trauma of my childhood. I majored in finance, discovering a talent for numbers and analysis that I never knew I had. Whatever the reason, I graduated at the top of my class and landed a job at a prestigious financial firm in the city. Life was good. I had my own apartment, a job I loved, and a sense of peace I'd never known before. I kept in touch with my parents, visiting them on holidays and occasional weekends, but these visits were always tense. Sarah was still living at home, having chosen to attend a local community college. Every time I saw her, I could feel her resentment simmering just beneath the surface. It was a typical Friday at work when I got the call that would shatter my carefully constructed peace. I was in the middle of analyzing some market trends when my phone buzzed. It was my mother. "Amanda," she said, her voice tight with tension. "We need to talk. It's about your sister. She's graduating soon, and, well, we think it would be best if she came to live with you in the city." I nearly dropped the phone. "What? Mom, no. That's not possible." "Don't be selfish, Amanda," my mother snapped. "Sarah needs this opportunity. And you have that big apartment all to yourself. Plus, we need you to cover her tuition for college." I felt like I was drowning. All the old feelings of helplessness and fear came rushing back. "Mom, I can't. My apartment isn't big enough, and I can't afford." "Can't afford it?" my mother interrupted. "With that fancy job of yours? Don't lie to us, Amanda. We know you're doing well for yourself." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Mom, it's not about the money. Sarah and we don't get along. You know that." "Oh, not this again," my mother sighed. "Amanda, when are you going to let go of this childish jealousy? Your sister needs you. This is what family does." I closed my eyes, feeling a headache coming on. "I'm sorry, Mom. The answer is no. I can't have Sarah living with me, and I won't pay for her tuition. I have my own life, my own expenses." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When my mother spoke again, her voice was cold. "I see. Well, I hope you're happy with your decision, Amanda. Don't bother coming home for Christmas this year." Later that evening, as I was trying to distract myself with work, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Sarah. "You'll regret this," it read. Just 3 words, but they sent a chill down my spine. I tried to shake it off. Sarah was hundreds of miles away. What could she possibly do to me now? Months flew by after that tense phone call with my parents. I threw myself into my work, trying to push thoughts of my family to the back of my mind. My life in the city continued. I excelled at my job, made new friends, and even started dating a bit. Then, on a random Tuesday, my phone rang. It was my mother. "Amanda," she said, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. We need you to come home. It's important. Against my better judgment, I took a month's vacation from work and boarded a plane back to my hometown. As I walked up the familiar driveway, a sense of dread washed over me. What could be so important that they needed me home for a whole month? We gathered in the living room, an uneasy silence falling over us. Finally, my mother spoke. "Your great-aunt Mildred called us," she said. "She wants all 4 of us to visit her in Hawaii. She's even booked the plane tickets herself." I blinked in surprise. Aunt Mildred had always been kind to me as a child, but I hadn't seen her in years. "All 4 of us?" I asked, glancing at Sarah. Sarah snorted. "It's ridiculous. Amanda doesn't need to go. She hasn't even talked to Aunt Mildred in years." "Hush," my father said sternly. This was Mildred's condition. All 4 of us, or none of us. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. I could almost see the gears turning in everyone's heads. Finally, my mother voiced what we were all thinking. Do you think she might be dying? That this is about her will?" The atmosphere in the room shifted. I saw a glimmer of something in Sarah's eyes. Greed? Excitement? It made me uneasy. "We shouldn't jump to conclusions," I said quickly. "Maybe she just wants to see all of us." But even as I said it, I knew it was unlikely. Aunt Mildred had always been a bit of a recluse. For her to suddenly want a family reunion in Hawaii, it had to be something big. As we discussed the logistics of the trip, I found myself getting excited despite my reservations. I had fond memories of Aunt Mildred from my childhood. She had always been kind to me, always had a moment to listen when no one else did. The thought of seeing her again, of spending time in beautiful Hawaii, was appealing. But there was still a nagging worry in the back of my mind. I glanced at Sarah, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since her initial outburst. She caught my eye and smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. It was the same smile she'd given me countless times before pulling some elaborate scheme to get me in trouble. I tried to shake off the feeling. We were adults now. Surely Sarah wouldn't try anything, not with so much potentially at stake. And yet, the day of our departure finally arrived. Despite my lingering unease, I found myself caught up in the excitement of the trip. We arrived at the airport, our family presenting a united front for what felt like the first time in years. As we approached the security checkpoint, I allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, this trip could be a fresh start for all of us. How naive I was. Just as we were about to go through security, a stern-faced officer approached me. "Ma'am, I need you to come with me," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Confused and a little scared, I looked at my family. "What's going on?" The officer's face remained impassive. "We received an anonymous tip that you're carrying prohibited items in your luggage. We need to do a thorough check." My heart sank as I turned to look at Sarah. There it was, that familiar gleeful smile, the one that always spelled trouble for me. In that moment, I knew exactly what had happened. "It was her," I said, pointing at Sarah. "She sent that message. She's trying to sabotage me." My parents' faces clouded over with anger, but to my shock, it was directed at me. "Amanda," my mother hissed. "How dare you accuse your sister like that? Again with this nonsense?" I tried to protest, but my father cut me off. "Enough, Amanda. Go with the officer. We'll sort this out." Just then, an announcement echoed through the terminal, "Final boarding call for Flight 372 to Honolulu." My parents exchanged a look of panic. "That's our flight," my mother said. "Please," I begged, my voice cracking. "Wait for me. I'll sort this out quickly, I promise." But my pleas fell on deaf ears. My father shook his head, not meeting my eyes. "We can't miss this flight, Amanda. You know how important this is." "We'll see you in Hawaii," my mother added, already turning away. I watched in disbelief as my parents walked away, not even glancing back. Only Sarah looked back, her triumphant smile cutting me to the core. Then she too disappeared into the crowd, leaving me alone with the security officer. The next few hours were a blur of invasive searches and endless questions. They went through every item in my luggage, every pocket of my clothing. I had to wait for a female officer to be available for a pat-down. By the time they finally concluded that I wasn't carrying anything illegal, my family's plane was long gone. As I sat in the now quiet airport, I faced a choice. I could book a flight for the next day, join my family in Hawaii, and try to salvage this disaster of a trip. Or I looked at the departure board. There was a flight leaving for my city in an hour. Back to my job, my friends, my life. Away from the drama and pain that seemed to follow my family wherever they went. In that moment, I made my decision. I walked up to the ticket counter and bought a one-way ticket home. As I boarded the plane, I felt a mixture of hurt, anger, and an odd sense of relief. Yes, I was letting Aunt Mildred down, and I felt guilty about that. But for once, I was choosing myself. My peace, my sanity. A few days after returning home, I was settling back into my routine, trying to push the airport incident out of my mind. I was just beginning to relax when my phone rang. It was my mother. Amanda, her voice trembled, thick with emotion. My heart raced, sensing something was terribly wrong. Your sister, Sarah's been arrested. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Arrested? What for? My mother's story came out in a rush of words, each one more shocking than the last. They had arrived at Aunt Mildred's house in Hawaii, only to find her furious that I wasn't there. She refused to discuss her will without all four of us present, Mom explained. We had to stay at her house while we tried to figure out what to do. I felt a pang of guilt, quickly overshadowed by my mother's next words. Then it happened. Your aunt, she almost fell down the stairs. She could have broken her neck, Amanda. What? Is she okay? I asked, concerned for the aunt I remembered so fondly. She's fine, thank goodness. But Amanda, it wasn't an accident. It was Sarah. She pushed her. I felt the blood drain from my face. How do you know? There were cameras. Hidden all over the house. They caught everything. The pieces started falling into place. The anonymous tip at the airport, Sarah's triumphant smile, it had all been part of her plan. A plan that had backfired spectacularly. Aunt Mildred called the police, my mother continued, her voice breaking. When they came to arrest Sarah, she lost it. Started screaming about how she just wanted the money, how she'd been waiting for years for this opportunity. I listened in stunned silence as my mother recounted Sarah's meltdown. How she'd screamed that she hated our parents, that she was just waiting for them to die so she could inherit everything. We were blind, Amanda, my mother sobbed. How could we not have seen it? How could we have been so wrong about her? As I listened to my mother's broken words, a whirlwind of emotions swept through me. Shock at Sarah's actions. Vindication that her true nature had finally been revealed. Sadness for my parents, whose world had just been shattered. And buried beneath it all, a tiny, shameful spark of satisfaction that they finally understood what I'd been trying to tell them for years. As we ended the call, I sat in silence, trying to wrap my head around everything that had happened. The sister I'd grown up with, who I'd always known was manipulative, had crossed a line I never thought possible. She'd tried to seriously harm our great-aunt, all for the chance at an inheritance. When I arrived at my childhood home, the atmosphere was completely different from my last visit. Gone was the tension and unspoken resentment. Instead, I found my parents looking older, more vulnerable, but also more open than I'd ever seen them. Amanda, my mother said, her voice thick with emotion as she embraced me. We're so sorry. We've been blind for so long. My father, a man never comfortable with emotional displays, simply placed a hand on my shoulder. We should have listened to you, he said gruffly. Can you forgive us? It was a moment I'd dreamed of for years, but now that it was here, I found myself overwhelmed. Of course, I managed to say, tears welling up in my eyes. Of course I forgive you. We spent hours talking, really talking, for what felt like the first time in years. They shared their shock at Sarah's actions, their guilt over dismissing my concerns for so long, and their fear for the future. I listened, offering support and finally feeling heard. But our fragile peace was soon shattered. We received word that Aunt Mildred had withdrawn her statement to the police, and Sarah was being released. The news hit us like a physical blow. "She can't come back here," my father said, his voice firm. "We can't trust her anymore." What followed was a painful but necessary process. My parents, with my support, filed for Sarah's eviction. They presented the court with evidence of her threats in Hawaii, her actions towards Aunt Mildred, along with a history of manipulative behavior. The court ruled in our favor. Sarah was to be evicted from the family home. When she came, my parents didn't even let her in the house. They left her belongings on the porch, a final, symbolic separation. Sarah's response was predictably spiteful. As she drove away, presumably out of our lives for good, she left one last parting shot, a string of vicious curses spray-painted on the side of the house. It was childish, petty, and so typically Sarah that it almost made me laugh. Almost. Then, out of the blue, I received a call from Aunt Mildred. "Amanda, dear," she said, her voice warm, despite everything that had happened. "I think it's time you came to visit me in Hawaii. Just you this time." I was hesitant at first, but something in her voice convinced me. A week later, I found myself on a plane to Hawaii, unsure of what to expect. Aunt Mildred's house was beautiful, perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean. She greeted me with a warm hug, looking far more spry than I'd imagined given recent events. "I'm so glad you're here," she said, leading me into her study. "There's something I need to show you." She pulled out a document, her will. As I scanned the pages, my eyes widened in shock. Aunt Mildred had left everything, her house, her investments, everything, to me. "But, why?" I stammered, looking up at her in disbelief. Aunt Mildred smiled, a twinkle in her eye. "Because, my dear, you're the only one who never came here looking for a handout. You're the only one who saw me as family, not as a potential windfall." More than the inheritance itself, what touched me was the recognition. After years of being overlooked and dismissed, someone had seen my true worth. As I hugged Aunt Mildred, tears in my eyes, I felt like I was finally, truly coming home. My name is Melissa, and I grew up in a typical middle-class family. Mom worked as a nurse, and Dad was a mechanic. We weren't rich, but we had enough to get by comfortably. After graduating from college with a degree in education, I landed a job at a public elementary school in my hometown. My days were filled with lesson plans, finger paintings, and the infectious laughter of children. One Friday evening, my best friend Sarah insisted I join her for a party. Reluctantly, I agreed. I threw on a simple blue dress and headed to the address Sarah had texted me. The party was in full swing when I arrived, the small apartment packed with people I didn't know. "Melissa," Sarah's voice cut through the noise. She appeared at my side, grinning widely. "I'm so glad you came. There's someone I want you to meet." Before I could protest, she was dragging me through the crowd. We stopped in front of a tall, handsome man with dark hair and warm brown eyes. "Melissa, this is Jack," Sarah said, practically beaming. "Jack, meet my best friend, Melissa." Jack smiled and extended his hand. "Nice to meet you, Melissa. Sarah's told me a lot about you." We fell into an easy conversation about my job, his work as a software developer, and our shared love of old movies. Before I knew it, hours had passed, and the party was winding down. As I was getting ready to leave, Jack approached me. "I really enjoyed talking to you tonight, Melissa. Would you like to grab coffee sometime?" My heart skipped a beat. "I'd like that," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. We exchanged numbers, and I left the party feeling giddy. The next day, I woke up to a text from Jack. "Good morning, Melissa. How about that coffee? Are you free this afternoon?" I replied quickly, and we made plans to meet at a local cafe. That coffee date was the beginning of something special. Over the next few weeks, Jack and I saw each other regularly. We went to movies, tried new restaurants, and took long walks in the park. With each date, I felt myself falling for him more and more. One evening, about a month after we met, Jack took me to a fancy restaurant for dinner. As we finished our meal, he reached across the table and took my hand. "Melissa," he said, his eyes serious. "I really like you. I was wondering if you'd like to be my girlfriend?" My heart soared. "Yes, Jack. I'd love to be your girlfriend." Jack was everything I'd ever wanted in a partner, kind, funny, and supportive. One evening, as we cuddled on my couch watching an old black and white film, I turned to Jack. "Have you told your parents about us?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. Jack's body tensed slightly. "Not yet," he replied, his eyes fixed on the TV screen. "I haven't found the right moment. I'll tell them when the time is right." I wanted to press the issue, but something in Jack's demeanor made me hold back. Instead, I snuggled closer to him, pushing my concerns to the back of my mind. The next week, I invited Jack to dinner at my parents' house. Mom and Dad had been asking to meet him for weeks, and I was excited for them to get to know the man I was falling in love with. "Mom, Dad, this is Jack," I said, beaming as we walked into the living room. My parents welcomed Jack warmly. Mom had prepared her famous pot roast, and we all sat down to a lovely meal. The conversation flowed easily, with Jack charming my parents with stories about his work and his travels. The evening ended on a high note, with my parents pulling me aside as Jack went to get our coats. "He's wonderful, honey," Mom whispered, giving me a hug. "We're so happy for you." As Jack and I drove home, I couldn't help but bring up the subject of his parents again. "Jack, why haven't you introduced me to your family yet? Are you ashamed of me?" Jack's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Of course not, Melissa. It's just, my parents can be a bit difficult. I want to make sure the timing is right." I sighed, not entirely satisfied with his answer, but decided to let it go for now. Our relationship continued to grow stronger over the next year and a half. Yet, the issue of his parents remained a sore spot. Every time I brought it up, Jack would find a way to change the subject or make light of the situation. I tried to be patient, to trust that he had his reasons, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something from me. Then, on a crisp autumn evening, everything changed. Jack proposed to me at the restaurant, and I agreed to the sound of applause from other customers. On the drive home, still giddy with excitement, I turned to Jack. "I can't wait to tell my parents. They're going to be so thrilled." Jack smiled, but I noticed a hint of tension in his expression. "Actually, Mel, I think it's time you met my parents. How about we go see them this weekend?" I was surprised by the sudden change of heart, but delighted nonetheless. "Really? That would be wonderful, Jack." When we pulled up to Jack's childhood home, I couldn't help but gasp. The house was enormous, a sprawling mansion with manicured lawns and a fountain in the circular driveway. In the parking area, I spotted 3 luxury cars that probably cost more than my yearly salary. "Jack," I whispered, my eyes wide. "You never told me your family was, well, rich." He shrugged, looking uncomfortable. "It never seemed important. Come on, let's go in." As we approached the front door, it swung open to reveal a statuesque woman with perfectly coiffed hair and an expensive-looking suit. "Jack, darling," she exclaimed, pulling him into a hug. Her eyes fell on me, and I saw a flicker of something, disappointment, cross her face. "And you must be Melissa," she said, her tone noticeably cooler. "I'm Victoria, Jack's mother. Please, come in." We followed her into a lavish living room where Jack's father, Richard, was waiting. He greeted us warmly, shaking my hand with a firm grip. "So, you're the young lady who's stolen our Jack's heart," he said with a smile. Victoria gestured for us to sit and then began her interrogation. "So, Melissa, tell us about yourself. What do you do for a living?" I'm a teacher at Jefferson Elementary, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I teach third grade. Victoria's eyebrows rose. A teacher? How quaint. And your family? What do they do? I explained about my parents' occupations, watching as Victoria's expression grew more and more disapproving. By the time I finished, the atmosphere in the room was tense. Victoria smiled tightly. Well, Melissa, she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. I must say, you're not quite what I had in mind for Jack. You're simply not the kind of girl I envisioned as a daughter-in-law. I felt as if I'd been slapped. Tears pricked at my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Richard cleared his throat. Victoria, that's enough. Jack is old enough to make his own decisions about who he wants to marry. Victoria pursed her lips, but said nothing more. The rest of the visit passed in uncomfortable small talk until Jack and I made our excuses to leave. As we drove home in silence, I finally let the tears fall. They hate me, don't they? I choked out. Jack reached over and took my hand. They don't hate you, Mel. My mother, she's just very particular. That's why I put off this meeting for so long. I'm sorry you had to go through that. In the months following our engagement, Jack and I threw ourselves into wedding planning. We wanted a small, intimate ceremony with just our closest friends and family. However, Victoria had other ideas. One afternoon, as Jack and I were discussing potential venues, my phone rang. It was Victoria. Melissa, dear, she said, her voice sickly sweet. I've been thinking about your wedding. I've taken the liberty of contacting some of the finest venues in the city. Oh, and I have a list of at least 100 guests we simply must invite. I felt my stomach drop. That's very kind of you, Victoria, but Jack and I were hoping for something smaller. Nonsense, she interrupted. My son is getting married. It has to be a grand affair. I want all my friends to see how happy he is. The next day, we met with Victoria to discuss the wedding plans. Jack was firm, explaining that we wanted a small ceremony and couldn't afford an extravagant affair. Victoria's face turned cold. I see. Well, if that's how you feel, perhaps I should withdraw my offer to help. After all, it seems you two have it all figured out. Despite the tension, we stood our ground. In the end, we planned the wedding we wanted, a simple ceremony in a local park, followed by a reception at a charming restaurant. The morning of the wedding arrived, and I was a bundle of nerves. The ceremony was beautiful. Jack's eyes filled with tears as I walked down the aisle, and when we said our vows, I felt like my heart might burst with happiness. During the toasts, Victoria stood up, glass in hand. My stomach clenched, dreading what she might say. Well, she began, her voice carrying across the room. This certainly isn't the wedding I envisioned for my son. But I suppose we must make do with what we have. A shocked murmur ran through the guests. Victoria continued, her words becoming increasingly critical of the simple decorations, the food, and even my dress. With each word, I felt smaller and more humiliated. Finally, she turned her gaze directly to me. I must say, I'm not entirely comfortable in this company. I think it's best if I take my leave early. With that, she set down her glass and swept out of the room, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. Our friends and family rallied around us, offering words of support and trying to lift the mood. Gradually, the party resumed, and by the end of the night, Victoria's dramatic exit was almost forgotten in the joy of celebration. After our honeymoon, Jack and I settled into married life in his apartment. However, my happiness was short-lived as Victoria began to make her presence felt in increasingly intrusive ways. One afternoon, I came home early from school to find Victoria in our living room, rearranging our furniture. I was shocked to see her there, especially since we hadn't given her a key. When Jack got home, I told him what had happened. He looked uncomfortable, but promised to talk to his mother about boundaries. However, Victoria's unexpected visits continued. She'd show up unannounced, always with some excuse about helping or checking on us. One day, as I was leaving for work, I overheard Victoria talking to our neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, in the hallway. I stopped short when I heard my name. "You know, you really should keep an eye on Melissa," Victoria was saying in a low voice. "She comes from a less desirable area. One can never be too careful with their jewelry." Over the next few weeks, I noticed a change in how some of our neighbors treated me. Friendly smiles were replaced with wary glances, and casual conversations in the elevator became awkward silences. It was clear that Victoria's words had had an effect. That evening, I broke down in tears as I told Jack what I'd overheard. He was angry and immediately confronted his mother, demanding she return the spare key she'd somehow obtained. Victoria's response was to play the victim, accusing me of turning her son against her. She began posting thinly veiled criticisms of me on social media, never mentioning me by name but making it clear who she was talking about. Then, one day, I was called into the principal's office at school. Mr. Thompson, my boss, looked uncomfortable as he slid an envelope across his desk to me. "Melissa, we received this, complaint about you," he said, his voice kind but concerned. Normally, we don't put much stock in anonymous letters, but given the nature of the accusations, I felt I should bring it to your attention. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope and read the letter. It was a litany of false accusations, everything from theft to inappropriate behavior with students. My mind reeled. There was only one person who could be behind this, Victoria. Mr. Thompson assured me he didn't believe the accusations, but warned me that rumors had started circulating among some of the staff. As I left his office, I could feel the stares of my colleagues, hear the whispers behind my back. As the months passed, what should have been joyous family gatherings turned into nightmarish ordeals. Every holiday, every family dinner became an opportunity for Victoria to belittle and humiliate me in front of Jack's friends and relatives. The breaking point came at a party Victoria hosted at her home. I'd worn a simple white skirt, feeling pretty and confident for once. As the evening wore on, I noticed people giving me odd looks and snickering behind their hands. It wasn't until Jack arrived late and pulled me aside that I learned the horrifying truth. "Mel," he said, his face a mix of anger and embarrassment, "there's a huge red stain on the back of your skirt. It looks like ketchup." My cheeks burned with humiliation as I realized I'd been walking around all evening with this stain, completely unaware. But worse was to come. Victoria, it seemed, had been busy taking photos of me throughout the night, always angled to prominently display the stain. By the time we got home, these photos were all over social media, accompanied by Victoria's mocking comments. The next day at school was a nightmare. Some of my students had seen the photos, and I could hear their whispered jokes and giggles. It took all my strength not to break down in tears in front of my class. That evening, I told Jack I couldn't take it anymore. "I'm done with these family gatherings," I said, my voice trembling. "I can't keep subjecting myself to your mother's cruelty." To my relief, Jack agreed. "You're right, Mel. We'll stop attending. My mother's behavior is unacceptable." Amidst this turmoil, I discovered I was pregnant. For a brief, shining moment, I hoped this news might soften Victoria's heart. Perhaps the prospect of a grandchild would bring peace to our fractured family. I couldn't have been more wrong. Victoria's reaction to the news was chilling. "Are you sure it's Jack's?" she asked, her voice dripping with insinuation. "After all, you two haven't been around much lately. Who knows what you've been up to?" I was stunned by her accusation, but I soon realized it was more than just cruel words. I began to notice a car following me on my way to and from work. At first, I thought I was being paranoid, but the same nondescript sedan kept appearing wherever I went. Shaken, I called the police. To my shock, when they tracked down and questioned the man, he admitted he was a private detective hired by Victoria to follow me. She had convinced herself that I was cheating on Jack and that the baby wasn't his. When Jack found out, he was livid. He confronted his mother in a heated phone call that I could hear from across the room. Victoria, caught red-handed, had no choice but to call off the detective. Months passed, and soon it was time for our baby to arrive. The delivery was long and difficult, but when I finally held our son in my arms, all the pain melted away. However, as I looked at him, I noticed something unexpected. Our beautiful baby boy had a much darker complexion than either Jack or me. He looked almost biracial. A seed of doubt planted itself in my mind. Would Jack think I'd been unfaithful? Before he could voice any suspicions, I insisted on a DNA test. The wait for the results was agonizing, but finally, we got the news: Jack was indeed our son's biological father. The doctor, seeing our confusion, suggested another possibility. It's possible this trait comes from one of your parents. We could do DNA tests on them as well, to trace the genetic line. My parents, when approached with the idea, were calm and agreeable. They understood our confusion and were happy to help solve the mystery. But the thought of telling Victoria made my blood run cold. Given her past accusations and behavior, I feared how she might react to this news. Would she use this as ammunition in her ongoing campaign against me? As I cradled our beautiful, mysterious baby boy, I looked at Jack. "What are we going to do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jack took my hand, his eyes full of love and determination. "We're going to love our son, no matter what. And we'll get to the bottom of this. Together." The day Victoria first saw her grandson should have been a joyous occasion. Instead, it turned into a nightmare. As soon as she laid eyes on our beautiful baby boy, her face contorted with shock and disgust. "What is this?" she shrieked, recoiling from the crib. "This child is too dark. He can't be Jack's." Before I could even respond, she rounded on me, her eyes blazing with fury. "You whore! You cheated on my son with some black guy from the alley, didn't you?" "Victoria, please," I begged, tears welling in my eyes. "We've done a DNA test. Jack is the father. I've never been unfaithful." But she was beyond reason. She stormed out of our apartment, and I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. A few hours later, when I returned from a quick errand, I found all of my belongings strewn across the hallway outside our apartment. Clothes, books, even my underwear, all scattered on the floor for anyone to see. I stood there, shocked and humiliated, as neighbors peeked out of their doors to see what the commotion was about. Jack was livid when he came home and saw what his mother had done. He immediately called her, putting her on speakerphone so I could hear. "Mom, this has to stop," he shouted. "We've done a DNA test. I am the father. Melissa has never cheated on me." Victoria's voice was cold and dismissive. "DNA tests can be faked. I know what I see." We even had my parents take DNA tests, which confirmed their relationship to our son. But Victoria refused to listen to reason. When we suggested she and Jack's father take tests as well, she categorically refused. Victoria's obsession only grew worse over time. She began calling me from unknown numbers, leaving threatening voicemails. "Admit you cheated, or I'll destroy both your careers," she hissed in one particularly chilling message. She sent compromising letters to both Jack's workplace and my school. The stress became so overwhelming that I had to quit my job and find a position at another school across town. But even that wasn't enough. Victoria's campaign of harassment escalated. She planted threatening letters in our mailbox. She even went so far as to hire actors to harass me in public, taking photos of these staged encounters and sending them to Jack as proof of my infidelity. One night, as we lay in bed, both too stressed to sleep, I turned to Jack. "I'm worried about your mother," I whispered. "This behavior, it's not normal. I think she might need help." Jack nodded slowly. "I've been thinking the same thing. But she'd never agree to see someone." The next day, I decided to reach out to Jack's father, Richard. We met at a quiet cafe, away from prying eyes. Over coffee, I poured out everything that had been happening, the harassment, the threats, the elaborate schemes Victoria had concocted. Richard listened, his face growing more and more concerned. When I finished, he sat back with a heavy sigh. "I've noticed changes in her behavior," he admitted. "But I had no idea it had gotten this bad." "You're right, she needs help." But she'd never agree to see a psychiatrist willingly. We spent the next hour brainstorming how we could get Victoria the help she clearly needed without her knowing. Richard's plan was simple, but effective. Under the guise of changing insurance providers, he convinced Victoria to undergo a comprehensive health checkup at a new clinic. To our surprise, she agreed without much fuss. The day of the examination arrived, and we all waited anxiously for the results. When they came, they were more shocking than any of us could have imagined. Victoria was diagnosed with a complex mental illness, one that was genetically transmitted through the female line in her family. The doctor explained that without early intervention, the women in her family tended to experience severe mental health deterioration as they aged. Victoria's erratic behavior and obsessive actions were symptoms of this progressive condition. The news hit us all hard, but it also brought a sense of relief. There was a reason for Victoria's actions, a medical explanation for the torment she had put us through. With the diagnosis came a treatment plan, and Victoria was admitted to a specialized clinic for care. But the revelations didn't stop there. Richard, in an attempt to understand the genetic components of Victoria's condition, decided to undergo genetic testing himself. The results shook our family to its core. Richard was not Jack's biological father. When Richard shared this news with us, the pieces suddenly fell into place. It wasn't me who had been unfaithful, it was Victoria, years ago, with a man of African descent. The very thing she had accused me of, she had done herself. I expected anger or resentment from Richard, but his reaction surprised me. He looked at Jack with tears in his eyes and said, "Son, I may not be your biological father, but I raised you. I loved you from the moment you were born, and nothing will ever change that. You are my son in every way that matters." Jack hugged his father tightly, affirming that Richard was and always would be his dad. As for his biological father, Jack decided he had no interest in searching for him. "The man who raised me, who stood by me through everything, that's my real father," he declared. With Victoria receiving the care she needed and the truth finally out in the open, a sense of peace settled over our family. Richard, free from Victoria's influence, became a doting grandfather to our son. He would spend hours playing with him, marveling at his curly black hair and striking blue eyes. One evening, as we sat in the living room of Richard's spacious house, he made an unexpected proposal. "Why don't you all move in here?" he suggested. "This place is too big for just me, and I'd love to have my family close." Jack and I exchanged glances, then smiled. It felt right, like the beginning of a new chapter for all of us. We agreed, and within a few weeks, we had moved into Richard's home. Life settled into a new, happier rhythm. Our son grew into a handsome, swarthy boy, his mixed heritage evident in his features. But to us, and to everyone who knew our family's story, his appearance was simply a part of who he was, a beautiful, loved child. Victoria remained in the clinic, receiving the care she needed. While we didn't visit often, we made sure she was comfortable and well treated. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was one we could live with. My name's Isabella, and I'm 21 years old. I just finished my third year at art college, and let me tell you, it's been one hell of a ride. But before I get into all that, you need to know where I come from. I grew up in a house where I never felt at home. My parents, Tom and Sarah, always made it clear that my older sister, Emily, was their golden child. She's 4 years older than me and has always been a thorn in my side. From the day I was born, Emily seemed to hate me. She'd tease me, break my toys, and make my life miserable. And my parents? They'd just laugh it off, saying, "Oh, that's just how sisters are." But it wasn't normal. I remember when I was 14, I had this huge crush on a boy at school. His name was Jake, and I thought he was the cutest thing ever. I'd spend hours drawing portraits of him in secret, hiding them under my mattress where I thought no one would find them. But Emily found them. And you know what she did? She pinned them up on the school bulletin board for everyone to see. I still remember walking into school that day. The laughter, the pointing, the whispers. It felt like the whole world was crashing down around me. And Jake? He came up to me, all awkward and stuttering. Isabella. I saw the drawings. Look, you're nice and all, but I don't like you that way. I ran home crying that day. My parents were in the kitchen when I burst through the door, tears streaming down my face. Mom, Dad, Emily humiliated me at school. She found my private drawings in. But before I could finish, Emily waltzed in, a smug grin on her face. Oh, come on, Izzy, she said, using the nickname I hated. It was just a bit of fun. Not my fault you can't take a joke. And you know what my parents did? They laughed. They actually laughed. Sweetie, my mom said, wiping tears of mirth from her eyes. You really need to toughen up. It's not Emily's fault you're such a crybaby. That's why, when I got accepted into art college, I was over the moon. It was my ticket out of that house, away from the constant mockery and belittlement. My grandmother was the only one who ever showed me any real love. She was the one who encouraged my art, who told me I had talent. When I got accepted, she insisted on paying for my tuition. Isabella, she said, her eyes twinkling, you've got a gift. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. I'll make sure you get the education you deserve. For 3 years, she paid for everything. My tuition, my supplies, even some extra for living expenses. But then, just before my final year, she got sick. I remember sitting by her bedside, holding her frail hand. She looked at me with those kind eyes of hers and said, Isabella, my dear, I'm so proud of you. You're going to do great things. Then she turned to my parents, who were standing at the foot of the bed. Tom, Sarah, I need you to promise me something. Promise me you'll pay for Isabella's final year. She needs to finish her education. My parents nodded solemnly. Of course, Mom, my dad said. We promise. Grandma died a week later. At the reading of her will, we found out she'd left her house to my parents and her jewelry to Emily and me. Emily, of course, immediately grabbed the diamond tiara. I'll take this, she announced. Isabella can have the ring. She doesn't care about jewelry anyway, right, Izzy? I didn't argue. She was right, I didn't care much for jewelry. So I took the diamond ring and put it in a safety deposit box at the bank. I made friends quickly in college. There was Zoe, a punk rocker with a talent for abstract art, and Marcus, a quiet guy who could make sculptures that took your breath away. They didn't care about my family drama. To them, I was just Isabella, the girl who could paint like nobody's business. Hey, Bella, Zoe said one day, using the nickname I actually liked. There's a tattoo parlor downtown looking for someone to draw designs. You should apply. I was hesitant at first. My parents would flip if they knew I was working in a tattoo parlor. But then I thought, why should I care what they think? So I applied, and to my surprise, I got the job. The owner, a burly guy named Mike with more ink than skin, took one look at my portfolio and said, "You're hired, kid." For the first time in my life, I was earning my own money. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I didn't tell my parents or Emily about it. I could already hear Emily's mocking voice. Oh, little Izzy's drawing pictures for thugs now? How cute. College life suited me. I threw myself into my studies, determined to make my grandmother proud. My professors praised my work, and I even won a few small competitions. But more importantly, I was happy. The years flew by, and before I knew it, I was finishing up my 3rd year. As the summer break approached, a familiar dread settled in my stomach. I had to go home. I opened the door and stepped into chaos. The living room was full of people, all bustling about with excitement. In the center of it all stood Emily, beaming as she held up a white dress. My mother noticed me first. "Oh, Isabella," she said, her smile faltering slightly. "You're home. We weren't expecting you so soon." I stood there, stunned. Emily's getting married? When did this happen? Emily turned to me, her smile turning into a smirk. Oh, didn't anyone tell you? I guess we've all been so busy with the preparations, it must have slipped our minds. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. My own sister was getting married, and no one had even bothered to tell me. Who's the lucky guy? I managed to ask, trying to keep my voice steady. This is Richard, Emily said, pulling forward a tall, handsome man I hadn't noticed before. Isn't he dreamy? Richard gave me a polite smile and extended his hand. Nice to meet you, Isabella. I've heard so much about you. I shook his hand, wondering what exactly he'd heard. Knowing Emily, probably nothing good. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of excited chatter downstairs. Emily was holding court at the breakfast table, surrounded by our parents and a couple of her bridesmaids. As I listened to their conversation, I learned that Emily had broken up with her previous boyfriend at our parents' insistence. Apparently, he'd been mixed up with some dangerous crowd. Thank God you listened to us, sweetie, Mom said, patting Emily's hand. Richard is such a better match for you. And his family is so well off. I couldn't help but roll my eyes. Of course, that's what they cared about. Speaking of Richard, Emily said, turning to me with a smirk, he's taking me out to dinner tonight. Not that you'd know anything about that, right, Izzy? Still haven't found a boyfriend? They all laughed, and I gripped my coffee mug tighter, willing myself not to cry. Some things never change. As the days passed, I tried to stay out of everyone's way. I spent most of my time in my room, sketching and counting down the days until I could leave. But one evening, I couldn't avoid the family dinner. We were all seated around the table when Emily dropped her bombshell. I've decided to wear Grandma's tiara for the wedding, she announced. It'll look perfect with my dress. Oh, that's a wonderful idea, Mom exclaimed. Emily wasn't done. But you know what would make it even better? If I had a matching piece to go with it. Like, oh, I don't know, a ring? I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. I knew exactly where this was going. Mom's eyes lit up. Oh, that's right. Isabella, didn't Grandma leave you a ring? I nodded slowly, a sick feeling growing in my stomach. Well, there you go, Emily said, clapping her hands together. Izzy, you'll let me borrow the ring for the wedding, won't you? I put down my fork. Borrow? For how long? Emily laughed, a sound that sent chills down my spine. Oh, silly Izzy. I mean, you'll give it to me. For keeps. But Grandma left that to me, I protested weakly. Come on, Isabella, Dad said, his voice stern. Don't be selfish. It's your sister's wedding day. I looked around the table, hoping to see someone, anyone, on my side. But all I saw were expectant faces, waiting for me to give in. Like always. Isabella, Dad said, his voice cold. Either you give the ring to your sister, or we won't pay for your final year of college. The room fell silent. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. But you promised Grandma, I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. Emily let out a harsh laugh. Oh, please. No one cares about promises made to some half-witted old woman. I stood up so fast, my chair fell over. How dare you talk about Grandma like that? I shouted. That's enough, Dad roared. Isabella, you have a choice to make. The ring or your education. Decide. I looked at their faces, Dad's anger, Mom's disappointment, Emily's smug satisfaction. In that moment, I knew I had lost. Again. With shaking hands, I took off the necklace where I kept the key to my safety deposit box. I handed it to Emily. The morning after the ring incident, I cornered Emily in the kitchen. When exactly is your wedding? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Emily looked up from her coffee, a sly smile playing on her lips. It's on the 29th. Why, planning to ruin it? I ignored her jab. 2 weeks. I had 2 weeks to get away from this toxic environment. No, I replied coolly. I'm going to visit a friend from college. I'll be back in time for the wedding. I packed my bags and left that afternoon, heading to my friend Zoe's place in the next city over. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. Zoe and I spent the week exploring art galleries, hitting up local cafes, and just enjoying each other's company. It was exactly what I needed. But my moment of peace was shattered exactly 1 week later. I was scrolling through my social media feed when I saw it, photos of Emily's wedding. My sister, resplendent in white, the diamond tiara glittering on her head, and my ring sparkling on her finger. The caption read, "Just married. Off to the Maldives with my hunky husband." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. With shaking hands, I dialed Mom's number. "Why didn't you invite me to the wedding?" "Emily told me the wrong date." There was a long pause. Then Dad's voice came on the line. "Isabella, your sister, she didn't want you there. She said you'd ruin her perfect day. We thought it was best not to tell you." I felt like I was going to be sick. "How could you do this to me? I'm your daughter too." "Don't be dramatic," Mom chimed in. "It's not like you really wanted to be there anyway, right?" I hung up, my whole body shaking with anger and hurt. A few days later, I returned home, only to find Emily had also returned from her honeymoon. I walked into the living room to find her, Mom, and Dad huddled together, looking at apartment listings. I cleared my throat, and they all looked up. "Don't forget about my tuition," I said, my voice small. "You promised to pay for my last year if I gave Emily the ring." Dad shifted uncomfortably. "Actually, Isabella, we've decided to use that money as a down payment on Emily's apartment instead." I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. But you promised. You swore to Grandma." "Plans change," Mom said dismissively. "Emily needs it more. I'm sure you can figure something out." Emily was still laughing, a cruel, mocking sound that made my blood boil. Before I knew what I was doing, I lunged at her, grabbing a fistful of her hair. Emily screeched, and suddenly everyone was shouting. Dad yanked me away, his face red with anger. "That's enough," he roared. "Isabella, get out of this house right now." I ran to my room, threw some clothes in a bag, and stormed out, slamming the front door behind me. As I walked away from the house, my heart pounding and my cheeks wet with tears, I realized something. I found myself back at Zoe's place, feeling lost and broken. For days, I barely left her guest room, alternating between crying and staring blankly at the walls. Zoe tried her best to comfort me, but I was inconsolable. A week passed in this haze of despair. Then, one morning, as I listlessly checked my emails, I saw a message that made my heart stop. "Congratulations! You are the winner of the annual art school competition. Your prize includes a full scholarship for your final year of studies." I read the email 3 times, not believing my eyes. Then I let out a scream that brought Zoe running. I thrust my phone at her, happy tears streaming down my face. "I won. I won a scholarship. I can finish school." Zoe's eyes widened as she read the email, then she pulled me into a bone-crushing hug. "Oh my God, Bella. This is amazing." For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. I could finish my degree without my parents' help. I could make my own way. When the new semester started, I threw myself into my studies with renewed vigor. Between my classes and my part-time job at the tattoo parlor, I barely had time to think about my family drama. Months passed, and I slowly started to heal. One day, I was hanging out with my classmate, Jake, who worked part-time at a local pawn shop. We were chatting about our day when he mentioned something that caught my attention. "You won't believe what happened during my shift today," he said. "This girl came in with the most beautiful diamond necklace and ring I've ever seen. Must have been worth a fortune." My heart skipped a beat. "What did she look like?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Jake described a woman who sounded exactly like Emily. "Can you draw the jewelry for me?" I asked, my hands shaking slightly. Jake looked confused, but complied. As I watched him sketch, my suspicions were confirmed. The necklace was the one Emily had always bragged about, and the ring, it was my grandmother's ring. "Jake," I said, my mouth dry, "is there any way you could get me the security footage from the pawn shop?" Jake must have seen the desperation in my eyes because he finally nodded. "Okay, I'll see what I can do." A few days later, Jake handed me a USB drive. "Here," he said. "But you didn't get this from me, okay?" I nodded gratefully and rushed back to my dorm room. With trembling hands, I plugged in the drive and opened the video file. There was Emily, clear as day, handing over the jewelry. But what made my jaw drop was what happened next. As she turned to leave, a man entered the frame. Emily threw her arms around him, kissing him passionately. It wasn't Richard. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart pounding. As the man turned slightly, I gasped. I recognized him. It was Emily's ex-boyfriend, the one our parents had made her break up with because of his criminal connections. I sat back, my mind reeling. Emily had pawned her precious jewelry, including my grandmother's ring, and was apparently cheating on her husband with her criminal ex-boyfriend. Part of me wanted to immediately send this video to my parents, to Richard, to everyone who had ever believed Emily's lies. But another part of me hesitated. This was big. Too big to act on impulsively. Months passed, and I thought I'd put my family drama behind me. Then, out of the blue, my phone rang. It was my Aunt Lisa, my mom's sister. "Isabella, darling, I have wonderful news," she chirped, her voice bubbling with excitement. "Your sister is pregnant. Can you believe it? They're having a big announcement party next week. Isn't it exciting?" My heart sank. Of course, another family event I hadn't been invited to. "That's great, Aunt Lisa. Thanks for letting me know." After hanging up, I sat on my bed, conflicted. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to continue cutting ties with my toxic family. But another part of me, the part that still held on to the video from the pawn shop, knew this might be my chance. A week later, I found myself standing outside my parents' house. Cars lined the street, and I could hear laughter and chatter from inside. Taking a deep breath, I walked up to the front door and rang the bell. Mom opened the door, her smile instantly fading when she saw me. "Isabella, what are you doing here?" Pushing past her, I walked into the living room. The chatter died down as people noticed me. Emily, standing in the center of the room with Richard, looked like she'd seen a ghost. "What is she doing here?" Emily hissed. Dad's voice boomed through the room. "Isabella, get out of this house immediately. You're not welcome here." Confused murmurs rippled through the guests. I saw Richard's parents exchange worried glances. Mom, always one for saving face, plastered on a fake smile. "I'm so sorry, everyone. We've had to distance ourselves from Isabella. She's become quite greedy and unworthy of our family name." The room erupted into arguments. Some relatives defended me, while others sided with my parents. I raised my voice. "I have something to say." Gradually, the room quieted down. All eyes were on me. I turned to Emily. "Congratulations on your pregnancy, sis. But I have to ask, why aren't you wearing Grandma's tiara and ring?" Emily's face went pale. Her mother-in-law spoke up. "Now that you mention it, I haven't seen that beautiful ring in a while." "Emily, dear, where is it?" Emily stuttered. I sent them for restoration. They needed cleaning." I nodded slowly, pulling out my phone. "That's interesting. Because I have a video here that tells a different story." The color drained from Emily's face as I connected my phone to the TV. The security footage from the pawn shop began to play. There was Emily, clear as day, pawning the jewelry. And then, the moment that made everyone in the room gasp, Emily, throwing herself into the arms of a man who was definitely not Richard, kissing him passionately. The moment the video ended, chaos erupted in the living room. Richard's face contorted with rage and pain as he turned to Emily. "Emily, what is this? Who is that man?" he shouted, his voice cracking. Emily burst into tears, mascara streaming down her face. I can explain. Richard's mother stepped forward, her voice ice cold. I think we all deserve an explanation, Emily. Richard's father, a stern-looking man, spoke up. I think we need a paternity test. Immediately. As accusations flew and tempers flared, I quietly slipped out of the house. I had done what I came to do. The truth was out, and for the first time in years, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Over the next few weeks, the full extent of Emily's deception came to light. Through the family grapevine, I learned that she had been secretly meeting her ex-boyfriend, the one with criminal connections, behind Richard's back. She had been spending Richard's money on him and even pawned her jewelry to pay off his debts. The paternity test results were the final nail in the coffin. The baby wasn't Richard's, it was her ex-boyfriend's. Richard, understandably devastated, filed for divorce. He sued Emily for a substantial sum, citing emotional damages and financial fraud. Her ex-boyfriend, upon learning of the pregnancy, vanished without a trace, leaving Emily to face the consequences alone. My parents, who had always put Emily on a pedestal, were forced to face the harsh reality of her actions. They had to take out a significant loan to help Emily pay the compensation Richard demanded. Their golden child had fallen from grace, and they were left to pick up the pieces. In a twisted turn of events, they tried to blame me for everything. Mom left a voicemail on my phone, her voice bitter and accusing. Are you happy now, Isabella? You've ruined your sister's life. I hope you're proud of yourself. I deleted the message without responding. Their words no longer had the power to hurt me. As for me, I returned to college, threw myself into my studies, and focused on building the life I wanted. I cut off all communication with my family, changing my phone number and email address. The toxic cycle was finally broken. It's been 2 years since that fateful day when I exposed Emily's lies. I graduated from art college with honors, my final project earning praise from both professors and local art critics. Now, at 23, I'm working at the Harmony Art Gallery in the city. It's a dream come true, surrounded by beautiful artwork every day, helping to curate exhibitions, and even organizing events for up-and-coming artists. But that's not all. I've been painting in my free time, and to my surprise and delight, my work has caught the eye of several collectors. I haven't forgotten my roots, though. I still create tattoo sketches in my spare time. It's become a cherished hobby, a link to the past that reminds me of how far I've come. Some of my designs have even been featured in tattoo magazines, which never fails to make me smile. As for my family, well, that's a complicated story. I've maintained relationships with a few aunts and cousins who stood by me during the fallout. They keep me updated on the family drama, though I try not to let it affect me anymore. From what I hear, Emily is still living with our parents. She's unemployed, struggling to raise her child alone. Mom and Dad, facing financial troubles of their own, are constantly pressuring her to find a job and move out. The arguments are frequent and bitter, I'm told. I haven't spoken to my parents or Emily since that day. They tried reaching out a few times in the beginning, guilt-tripping messages, angry voicemails, but I stood firm in my decision to cut ties. Eventually, they stopped trying. On a brighter note, I've been dating a wonderful guy named Alex for the past year. He's a graphic designer I met at a gallery event. He's kind, supportive, and best of all, he understands my passion for art. We're talking about moving in together soon, another step towards building the life I want. My name is Kelly, and I married Tom when I was young and full of dreams. We'd been high school sweethearts, and I thought we'd be happy forever. My father, a successful businessman who owned a furniture factory, gave us a beautiful house as a wedding gift. 3 years after the wedding, our son Michael was born. As the years passed, I threw myself into being the perfect housewife and mother. I kept our home spotless, cooked gourmet meals, and made sure Michael had everything he needed. Tom's career as a sales manager wasn't progressing as quickly as he'd hoped. One night, he came home frustrated and angry. Damn it, Kelly. I can't take this anymore. I'm busting my ass at work, and for what? Pennies. He slammed his fist on the kitchen table, making me jump. What do you want me to do about it? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. Tom's eyes lit up. Your father. He could give me a job at his factory. A senior position. You could talk to him, couldn't you? I hesitated. My father had always been fair in his business dealings, and I didn't want to take advantage of our relationship. But seeing the desperation in Tom's eyes, I nodded. Okay, I'll talk to him. The next day, I visited my father at his office. Dad, I need to ask you something, I began nervously. It's about Tom. He's not happy with his job, and I was wondering if you might have a position for him here at the factory? After a long moment, my father nodded. All right, I'll give him a shot. But he'll have to prove himself like anyone else. When I told Tom the news, he was ecstatic. He picked me up and spun me around the kitchen. You're amazing, Kelly. This is going to change everything for us. And for a while, it did. Tom started earning more money, and our financial worries eased. But as one problem faded, another grew in its place, my relationship with Tom's mother, Helen. Helen was a force of nature, fiercely protective of her only son and openly disapproving of me. She'd drop by unannounced, criticize my housekeeping, and demand my constant attention. One afternoon, as I was trying to get dinner ready, Helen burst through the front door. Kelly, I need you to take me shopping right now. I gritted my teeth. Helen, I'm in the middle of cooking. Can it wait until tomorrow? Her eyes narrowed. Are you saying my needs aren't important? After all I've done for this family? I bit back a retort, knowing it would only make things worse. Of course not. Just give me a few minutes to finish up here. As I drove Helen to the mall, listening to her complaints about my driving, my cooking, and pretty much everything else, I couldn't help but wonder how my life had become this way. I was an intelligent, capable woman, yet here I was, catering to everyone else's whims while my own dreams gathered dust. One particularly frustrating afternoon, Helen barged into our home unannounced, as usual. Kelly, she called out, her voice grating on my already frayed nerves. I'm hungry. Make me something to eat. Biting my tongue, I set aside the laundry and trudged to the kitchen. As I prepared a meal for Helen, she sat at the kitchen table, criticizing my every move. You're using too much oil, she snapped. And for heaven's sake, cut those vegetables smaller. Don't you know how to cook properly? As I placed the finished meal in front of her, I hoped she'd eat quickly and leave. But to my dismay, she packed up all the food I'd prepared and stood up. I'll be taking this with me, she announced. I have bridge club tonight, and this will do nicely for snacks. I stared at her in disbelief. But Helen, that was supposed to be our dinner. Oh, you can always make more, she said, already heading for the door. It's not like you have anything better to do with your time. As the door slammed behind her, I sank into a chair, feeling defeated. I glanced at the clock, realizing I now had less than an hour to prepare another meal before Tom got home from work. When Tom arrived, he found me frantically trying to get dinner on the table. What's going on? He asked, loosening his tie. Why isn't dinner ready? I explained what had happened with his mother, hoping for some understanding or support. Instead, Tom's face darkened. Mom was here, and you didn't make her feel welcome? He demanded. Kelly, you know how important family is to me. You should have been more accommodating. Accommodating? I echoed, incredulous. Tom, she took our dinner. She treats me like a servant in my own home. Tom shook his head, clearly annoyed. You're exaggerating. Mom just wants to feel loved and appreciated. Is that too much to ask? As we ate the hastily prepared meal in silence, I couldn't help but feel a growing distance between us. Tom, once my high school sweetheart and closest confidant, now felt like a stranger across the dinner table. One evening, Tom came home from work in a foul mood. His face was red with anger as he slammed the front door behind him. "Kelly," he bellowed. "Your father is a tyrant, a despot. He humiliates people and uses them like pawns in his little game." I was taken aback. My father had always been fair and kind in my experience. "What happened?" I asked cautiously. Tom's eyes flashed with fury. "I stood up for an employee today. Your father was treating him unfairly, and I couldn't stand by and watch. And you know what your precious daddy did? He fired me on the spot." My mind reeled. This didn't sound like my father at all. "There must be some mistake," I said. "Let me talk to Dad and hear his side." "No," Tom roared, causing me to flinch. "You will not speak to your father. You will not speak to your mother. As far as we're concerned, they no longer exist for us. Do you understand?" Trembling, I nodded, too shocked and scared to argue further. In the days that followed, Tom found another job. He started earning well again, but the incident had changed something fundamental in our relationship. The warmth and love I once felt for him was replaced by fear and resentment. Years passed, and our son Michael grew up. He often asked about his grandparents, but Tom would shut down any conversation about them. "You have one grandmother," he would say firmly. "My mother. That's all you need to know." As Michael prepared to leave for college in another city, I felt a mix of pride and sadness. My baby was growing up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing the only ally I had in this house. Over the next few years, my life fell into a monotonous routine. I catered to Tom's every whim and endured Helen's constant criticism. Without Michael as a buffer, their treatment of me grew even more oppressive. One afternoon, as I was scrubbing the kitchen floor under Helen's watchful eye, the phone rang. I reached for it, but Helen snatched it away. "I'll answer it," she snapped. "You focus on getting that floor clean. I can still see spots." I gritted my teeth and returned to my task, but I couldn't help overhearing Helen's side of the conversation. "Yes, this is the residence of Kelly." "Who? Her father?" Helen's voice dripped with disdain. "I'm sorry, but Kelly isn't available to speak with you. Please don't call again." My head snapped up. "Wait," I called out, but Helen had already hung up the phone. "That was your father," she said coldly. "I told him not to contact you again. You should be thanking me for protecting this family from those toxic people." I felt a surge of anger and frustration. "You had no right to do that," I said, my voice shaking. "He's my father. I should have been allowed to speak to him." Helen's eyes narrowed. "You ungrateful little." Just then, Tom walked in. "What's going on here?" he demanded. Helen immediately put on a hurt expression. "Oh, Tom, your wife is being so disrespectful to me. After all I do for this family." Tom turned to me, his face dark with anger. "Is this true, Kelly? Are you disrespecting my mother?" I opened my mouth to explain, but the words wouldn't come. I realized with a sinking heart that it didn't matter what I said. Tom would always take Helen's side. A year passed since that fateful phone call from my father. Life continued its suffocating routine, with Tom and Helen's control over me growing tighter by the day. Then, on a crisp autumn morning, everything changed. The phone rang while I was preparing breakfast. Tom was in the shower, and Helen hadn't arrived for her daily inspection of my housekeeping. For once, I was able to answer without interference. "Hello?" I said tentatively. "Kelly? Is that you?" The voice on the other end was familiar, yet distant, my father's voice. "Kelly, it's your mother. She's very ill. The doctors, they don't think she has much time left. She needs you. We both do." Just then, I heard the bathroom door open. Tom would be down any minute. "I'll try, Dad. I promise I'll try," I whispered before quickly hanging up. When Tom entered the kitchen, I was fighting to compose myself. "Who was that on the phone?" he asked suspiciously. I took a deep breath. It was my father. My mother is very ill, Tom. She's dying. I need to go see her. Tom's face hardened. Absolutely not. We've been through this, Kelly. Your parents don't exist for us anymore. I felt something snap inside me. For the first time in years, I stood up to him. I'm going, Tom. With or without your permission. She's my mother, and I won't let her die without saying goodbye. Tom's jaw clenched. Fine. One day. That's all you get. And then you come back home where you belong. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. One day was better than nothing. With shaking hands, I called my son Michael and told him what was happening. To my surprise and relief, he immediately offered to accompany me. The next morning, Michael and I set off for my childhood home. When we arrived, my father met us at the door. He looked older than I remembered, grief etching deep lines in his face. Without a word, he pulled me into a tight embrace. He led us to my mother's room. She lay in bed, pale and frail, but her eyes lit up when she saw me. Kelly, she whispered, reaching out a trembling hand. My baby girl. I rushed to her side, clasping her hand in mine. Mom, I'm here. I'm so sorry. Can you ever forgive me? She smiled weakly. There's nothing to forgive, sweetheart. I'm just glad you're here now. We spent the day by her bedside, sharing memories and making up for lost time. As the sun began to set, my mother's breathing became labored. She squeezed my hand and looked into my eyes. Kelly, she said softly. Promise me you'll live your life. Really live it. Don't let anyone cage your spirit again. Tears streamed down my face as I nodded. I promise, Mom. I promise. She smiled one last time, then closed her eyes. Her hand went limp in mine. She was gone. Suddenly, my phone began to ring incessantly. I knew without looking that it was Tom. I answered the call, moving to the hallway for privacy. Tom's voice, sharp with anger, cut through the line. Where the hell are you, Kelly? You were supposed to be back hours ago. Tom, I can't leave yet, I stammered, my voice thick with emotion. My mother just passed away. I need to stay for the funeral. Absolutely not, he roared. I told you one day, and that's all you get. If you're not back by tomorrow, don't bother coming back at all. His words hung in the air, a threat and a promise all at once. For a moment, I was tempted to give in, to rush back to the life I knew. But then I remembered my mother's last words, urging me to live my life fully. Fine, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I'm staying. I ended the call before he could respond, my heart pounding. I had just defied Tom for the first time in our married life, and it was both terrifying and exhilarating. The next few days passed in a blur of grief and preparations. On the day of the funeral, as we stood solemnly around my mother's grave, my phone began to ring again. Tom's number flashed on the screen. Without thinking, I pressed the speaker button, if only to quickly silence it. Tom's voice, loud and angry, burst forth for all to hear. Kelly, this is your last chance, he yelled. If you don't come home right now, I swear I'll come and drag you back myself. You ungrateful filth, after everything I've done for you. I quickly ended the call, my face burning with shame and anger. The mourners around us looked shocked, and Michael's face was a mask of fury. My father looked more concerned than anything else. He pulled me aside as soon as the service was over. Kelly, he said gently, we need to talk. We walked to a quiet corner of the cemetery, and my father took a deep breath. Sweetheart, there's something you need to know about Tom. Something I should have told you years ago. I listened in stunned silence as my father revealed the truth about why Tom had really left the company all those years ago. It wasn't because he had stood up for an employee. It was because my father had caught him stealing money from the company and clients, manipulating prices, and pocketing the difference. I fired him to protect the company and our clients, my father explained. I didn't tell you because I thought you loved him, and I didn't want to come between you. But now, hearing how he speaks to you, seeing what your life has become, I can't stay silent anymore. I felt as if the ground had opened up beneath my feet. All these years, I had believed Tom's lies, allowed him to cut me off from my family, endured his and Helen's emotional abuse. And it had all been based on a lie. There's more, my father continued, his voice grave. I recently heard from a friend that Tom's company is under investigation. There are discrepancies, Kelly. I think he might be up to his old tricks again. As the full impact of his words hit me, I felt a strange mix of despair and liberation. The life I had known was crumbling around me, but from its ashes, I saw a chance for a new beginning. The day after the funeral, my father, Michael, and I decided to return to my house. To our surprise, we found the house bustling with activity. Helen's friends were milling about, and the smell of food wafted from the open windows. We walked in to find a full-blown party in progress. Helen, holding a glass of wine, spotted us first. Her eyes narrowed as she took in my father and Michael. "Well, look who finally decided to grace us with her presence," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're late, Kelly. My birthday celebration started hours ago." I was momentarily stunned. In all the turmoil of the past few days, I had completely forgotten about Helen's birthday. Before I could respond, she thrust a dirty rag into my hands. "Don't just stand there," she snapped. "Start cleaning up. These tables won't wipe themselves." My father, who had been silently observing, suddenly erupted. "How dare you speak to my daughter that way?" he thundered, causing the room to fall silent. "She's not a dog to follow your commands. She's a grown woman who deserves respect." Helen laughed derisively. "Respect? She gave up any right to respect when she married my son. Her family is Tom and me now. You're nothing to her anymore." I watched in disbelief as my father and Helen argued, their voices rising. The party guests looked uncomfortable, unsure whether to leave or stay. Suddenly, Tom burst into the room. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, his eyes locking onto me. "Kelly, why aren't you serving the guests? And what are they doing here?" He gestured angrily towards my father and Michael. Something inside me snapped. Years of pent-up frustration and anger came pouring out. "No, Tom," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I'm not serving anyone. I'm not cleaning up. And I'm not staying silent anymore." The room had gone deathly quiet. Even Helen seemed at a loss for words. "I know the truth, Tom," I continued, pulling out the divorce papers I had hastily prepared. "I know why you really left my father's company. And I'm done. I want a divorce." For a moment, Tom looked like he might lunge at me. But then, perhaps realizing he was outnumbered, he deflated. "Fine," he snarled. "Take your divorce. But don't think you'll get a penny from me." I couldn't help but laugh. "This house is mine, Tom. My father gave it to us as a wedding gift, remember? You're the one who needs to leave." Tom and Helen left shortly after, shooting venomous glares our way. As the door closed behind them, I sank onto the couch, suddenly exhausted. Michael, who had been quietly observing everything, finally spoke up. "Mom, why didn't you tell me things were so bad?" "I'm sorry, Michael," I said. "I thought I was protecting you. But I realize now that I was just teaching you the wrong lessons about love and respect." In the weeks that followed, my life transformed dramatically. The divorce proceedings began, and I threw myself into rebuilding my life. My father, true to his word, stood by me every step of the way. One afternoon, as we sat in his study discussing the future, my father broached a subject I hadn't expected. "Kelly," he began, his voice gentle but serious, "I've been thinking. I'm not getting any younger, and the factory needs new blood. How would you feel about coming to work with me?" I blinked in surprise. "Me? But Dad, I don't know anything about running a business." He chuckled. "Neither did I when I started. You're smart, Kelly. You can learn. Besides, it's about time you had a chance to spread your wings. Over the next few months, I immersed myself in learning the business. My father was a patient teacher, guiding me through the intricacies of running a furniture factory. I discovered a passion for design and innovation that I never knew I had. Meanwhile, the divorce proceedings dragged on. Tom, true to form, fought me every step of the way. He contested the ownership of the house, and even attempted to turn Michael against me. In the end, justice prevailed. I was awarded the house and substantial financial compensation for years of emotional abuse. Tom, facing charges for his fraudulent activities, found himself deep in debt and unable to hold senior positions anymore. As for Helen, she faded into the background, her influence over my life finally broken. The last I heard, she had moved in with a distant relative. Her social circle diminished after the truth about Tom came out. 3 years passed in what felt like a blink of an eye. Then, one sunny morning, my father called me into his office. His face was solemn as he gestured for me to sit. "Kelly," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, "I'm not well. The doctors, they don't think I have much time left." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "Dad, no," I whispered, reaching for his hand. He squeezed my fingers gently. "It's okay, sweetheart. I've had a good life. And now, I can go knowing that you're strong, that you're free, that you'll be okay." Tears streamed down my face as he continued. "I'm leaving everything to you, Kelly. The business, the house, all of it. You've more than proven yourself. I know you'll take good care of it all." In the weeks that followed, we spent as much time together as possible. My father's condition deteriorated rapidly, but his spirit remained strong. He passed away peacefully in his sleep, leaving behind a legacy that I was now responsible for carrying forward. The news of my father's passing and my inheritance spread quickly through our small town. I was still adjusting to my new reality when an unexpected visitor arrived at my doorstep. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when I heard the doorbell ring. Opening the door, I was shocked to see Tom standing there, a bouquet of flowers in his hand and an apologetic look on his face. "Kelly," he said, his voice softer than I'd heard it in years. "I'm so sorry about your father. May I come in?" Warily, I stepped aside to let him enter. We stood in the foyer, an awkward silence hanging between us. Finally, Tom spoke. "I've been doing a lot of thinking, Kelly. About us, about our life together. I know I made mistakes, terrible mistakes. But I've changed. My mother, she passed away last month. She was the one who always came between us. Now, there's nothing stopping us from being happy together again." As I opened my mouth to respond, I heard the sound of a car pulling up in the driveway. A moment later, the front door opened, and a tall, distinguished-looking man walked in. "Kelly, darling, I'm home," he called out, then stopped short when he saw Tom. Tom looked between us, confusion and anger dawning on his face. "Who the hell is this?" he demanded. The man stepped forward, extending his hand to Tom. "I'm David, Kelly's husband. And you are?" Tom ignored the outstretched hand, his face contorting with rage. "Husband? What the hell, Kelly? You remarried? You traitor!" David's expression hardened. He stepped between Tom and me, his voice low and dangerous. "I suggest you leave now, and never speak to my wife that way again." Tom lunged forward, but David was quicker. He caught Tom by the arm and firmly escorted him to the door. "This is your only warning," David said calmly. "Stay away from Kelly. If you ever come near her or insult her again, you'll regret it." With that, he shut the door in Tom's face. As the sound of screeching tires faded away, David turned to me, his face softening with concern. "Are you okay, love?" I nodded, stepping into his embrace. "I'm fine. I'm just glad you're home." I looked up at him, a smile playing on my lips. "And I'm glad you waited for me after all these years." David chuckled, pressing a kiss to my forehead. "I've loved you since high school, Kelly. I would have waited forever if I had to." As we stood there in each other's arms, I marveled at how life had come full circle. David and I had been high school sweethearts before Tom came into the picture. After my divorce, we had reconnected, and our old feelings had blossomed anew. We'd married in a quiet ceremony 6 months ago, starting a new chapter in both our lives. Just then, my phone buzzed with a text. It was from Michael. "Mom, great news. Jessica's pregnant. You're going to be a grandmother." In the months that followed, life settled into a beautiful rhythm. Michael and his wife Jessica moved back to our city, eager to be close to family as they prepared for their baby's arrival. They joined us at the factory, bringing fresh ideas and energy to the business. At 34, I'm Monica, a successful journalist at a top fashion magazine and a well-known fashion blogger. As I sit in my office, surrounded by racks of designer clothes and stacks of glossy magazines, I can't help but feel a sense of pride. I've worked hard to get here, and every late night and early morning has been worth it. My phone buzzes with a notification. It's an email from my editor. "Monica, great job on the latest piece. The readers are loving it. Keep it up." I smile to myself. This is what I live for, the rush of creating content that resonates with people, the thrill of being at the forefront of fashion trends. But it wasn't always like this. My mind drifts back to my childhood, to the house where I grew up. It was a nice house in the suburbs, but for me, it was more of a battlefield than a home. My sister, Sarah, is 7 years older than me. From the day I was born, she saw me as competition. I remember her constant need for attention, her jealousy, her manipulations. It's funny how some wounds never truly heal, even after all these years. There was this one time, when I was about 8. Sarah was 15 and had invited her friends over. I was in my room, reading a fashion magazine. Suddenly, I heard a crash from downstairs. My heart sank. I knew, somehow, that this wouldn't end well for me. I crept down the stairs to find my mother's favorite vase in pieces on the floor. Sarah and her friends were standing around it, looking guilty. But then Sarah's eyes locked with mine, and I saw a familiar glint in them. "Monica," she shrieked. "What have you done?" I stood there, mouth agape, as Sarah spun a tale of how I had been running wild through the house and knocked over the vase. Her friends, not wanting to get in trouble, nodded along. But I didn't, I started to say, but my parents had already made up their minds. "Monica, how could you be so careless?" my mother scolded. "You know how much I loved that vase." "You're grounded for a month," my father added. "And no pocket money until you've paid for a new vase." That night, as I lay in bed, I made a promise to myself. One day, I'd have my own place, my own life, far away from Sarah's shadow. And here I am now, living that promise. I've got my own house, bought with a mortgage I'm proud to pay off each month. It's my sanctuary, my piece of peace and quiet. As I wrap up my latest article on fall fashion trends, my mind wanders back to the day Sarah got married. I was 15, and I remember feeling an overwhelming sense of relief. Finally, I thought, I'd have some peace in my life. The wedding itself was a lavish affair. Sarah looked stunning in her white gown, but I couldn't help noticing the smug look she threw my way during the ceremony. A year after the wedding, Sarah had a daughter, my niece, Lily. As she grew, I found myself spending more and more time with her. Sarah seemed all too happy to pawn her off on me, preferring to spend her time gossiping with friends or scrolling endlessly on her phone. "Monica, can you take Lily this weekend?" Sarah's voice crackled through the phone. It was a familiar request. "I've got plans." I sighed, knowing full well that plans probably meant another meeting with chatty friends. "Sure, Sarah. I'd love to spend time with Lily." That weekend, I took Lily to a new children's entertainment complex that had just opened up in town. Her eyes lit up as we entered, taking in the colorful play areas and exciting activities. "Aunt Monica, look," Lily squealed, pointing at a giant slide. "Can we go on that?" I laughed, her excitement infectious. Of course we can, sweetie. We can do whatever you want today. As I dropped Lily off at home that evening, I overheard Sarah arguing with her husband, Mason. Their voices were muffled, but I caught snippets about Sarah's frequent absences and her disinterest in family life. I quickly ushered Lily inside, not wanting her to hear the argument. But as I turned to leave, Mason caught my arm. "Monica," he said, his voice strained. "I don't know what to do anymore. Sarah's never home, and when she is, she's glued to her phone. It's like Lily and I don't even exist to her." "I'm sorry," I said, not knowing what else to say. "If there's anything I can do to help with Lily, just let me know." He nodded gratefully, and I left, feeling a mix of emotions. Anger at Sarah for neglecting her family, worry for Lily, and a strange sense of vindication. All those years of Sarah tormenting me, and now her true colors were showing to everyone else too. The day everything fell apart started like any other. I was at a cafe with my friends when my phone rang. It was my mother, her voice tense and brittle. "Monica, you need to come home. Now." I arrived at my parents' house to find chaos. Sarah was sobbing on the couch, mascara streaking down her face. My father was pacing, red-faced with anger. And in the corner, looking shell-shocked, was Sarah's husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, as I would learn. "He caught me," Sarah wailed between sobs. With her lover," Mason spat out. "In our own bed." I stood there, stunned. Despite knowing about Sarah's indiscretions, seeing the fallout was something else entirely. And then, as always, Sarah's eyes locked onto me. "This is your fault," she shrieked, pointing an accusing finger. "If you hadn't been so perfect, if you hadn't taken up so much of Mom and Dad's attention, I wouldn't have had to look elsewhere for love." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Even now, faced with the consequences of her own actions, Sarah was trying to blame me. "That's enough, Sarah," I said, my voice cold. "You made your choices. Don't you dare try to pin this on me." My parents, predictably, rushed to Sarah's defense. "Monica, how can you be so heartless?" my mother cried. "Your sister is hurting." I looked at them, these people who had always taken Sarah's side, who had never believed me when I told them about her cruelty. In that moment, I made a decision that would change the course of my life. "I'm done," I said quietly. "I'm done with the drama, the accusations, the constant favoritism. I'm moving out." My parents protested, but their words fell on deaf ears. I was 22, fresh out of college, and ready to start my own life. Within a week, I had found a small apartment across town and moved out of my childhood home. The next few years were a whirlwind. I landed an entry-level job at a fashion magazine, throwing myself into work with a passion born of determination to succeed on my own terms. Nights were spent poring over fashion blogs, learning everything I could about the industry. All the while, I kept my distance from my family. Sarah and Lily had moved back in with our parents, but I tried to go there as little as possible. Still, I made an effort to stay in touch with Lily. We'd meet for ice cream or trips to the park, away from the watchful eyes of Sarah and my parents. Lily was growing into a sweet, thoughtful girl, so different from her mother that it sometimes took my breath away. As the years rolled by, my career took off like a rocket. At 34, I found myself in a position I'd only dreamed of as a fresh-faced college graduate. Senior journalist at a top fashion magazine, my byline recognized by industry insiders and fashion enthusiasts alike. But that wasn't all. I'd also cultivated a significant following as a fashion blogger, my social media filled with outfit ideas, trend forecasts, and behind-the-scenes peeks at the glamorous world of high fashion. My phone buzzed with a notification. Another 1,000 followers on Instagram. I smiled to myself, remembering the days when I'd celebrate each new follower like a personal victory. As I flipped through the glossy photos, my mind wandered to my own wardrobe. I'd come a long way from the hand-me-downs and bargain bin finds of my youth. Now, my closet was filled with designer pieces, each one carefully chosen to reflect my personal style and the image I wanted to project to the world. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Lily, now a teenager. "Aunt Monica, can you help me pick an outfit for my friend's birthday party this weekend?" I smiled, warmth filling my chest. Despite the distance I'd put between myself and Sarah, Lily and I had managed to maintain a close relationship. She'd inherited my love for fashion, and I relished every opportunity to share that passion with her. "Of course, sweetie," I texted back. "Why don't you come over on Saturday morning and we'll put something together?" Sarah. The thought of my sister still brought a twinge of discomfort. We barely spoke these days, our interactions limited to terse exchanges at family gatherings I couldn't avoid. She was still living with our parents, still playing the role of the wronged woman, still using Lily as a pawn in her games. But I refused to let thoughts of Sarah dampen my mood. I had too much to be grateful for, too much to look forward to. My career was thriving, I had a beautiful home that I'd bought with my own hard-earned money, I had Alex, my fiancé, and I was finally, truly happy. As I scrolled through the latest runway looks on my tablet, my phone rang. Sarah's name flashed on the screen, and I sighed, bracing myself for what was to come. "Monica," Sarah's voice was sharp, demanding. "Lily needs a new outfit for her school dance. Something designer, obviously. Just make sure it's expensive and trendy. Lily needs to look better than those other girls." Before I could respond, she hung up. I stared at the phone, a mix of anger and resignation washing over me. How had I become responsible for dressing my niece? Despite my frustration with Sarah, I couldn't help but feel excited about shopping for Lily. At 15, she was developing her own sense of style, and I loved helping her explore that. The next day, Lily and I hit the mall. We spent hours trying on dresses, giggling over some of the more outrageous designs. In the end, we settled on a beautiful emerald green dress that made Lily's eyes sparkle. As we left the store, bags in hand, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of resentment. I loved spoiling Lily, but Sarah's expectation that I would foot the bill for all of Lily's clothing needs was becoming too much. A week later, I found myself at my parents' house for a family dinner. The tension was palpable as soon as I walked in. "Well, look who decided to grace us with her presence," Sarah sneered from her spot on the couch, phone in hand as usual. I ignored her, focusing instead on Lily, who ran to give me a hug. "Aunt Monica, I wore the dress to the dance. Everyone loved it." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," I smiled, genuinely happy for her. My mother's voice cut through the moment. "Monica, don't you think it's a bit much? Buying such expensive clothes for Lily when your sister is struggling?" I blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me?" My father chimed in, his tone disapproving. "You're always dressed in designer clothes, driving that fancy car. Don't you think you could help out your family more?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Help out? I've been buying all of Lily's clothes for years now. Sarah hasn't spent a dime on her daughter's wardrobe and I don't know how long. Sarah's face twisted into a scowl. "Oh, so now you're going to throw that in my face? Some of us don't have cushy jobs writing about shoes all day." I stood there, stunned into silence. How could they not see the truth? How could they still be taking Sarah's side after all these years? As I drove home that night, tears of frustration stinging my eyes, I realized that some things would never change. No matter how successful I became, no matter how much I did for Lily, in my family's eyes, I would always be the selfish one, the one who needed to do more. However, there was something else in my life, besides a good job and a terrible family. My fiancé. 2 years had flown by since I met Alex. When he proposed on a quiet evening at home, I didn't hesitate to say yes. As a fashion journalist, I knew the importance of the perfect wedding dress. I reached out to a young Italian designer I'd featured in one of my articles. His avant-garde approach to bridal wear had caught my eye, and I knew he could create something truly special. When the dress arrived, my hands shook as I unzipped the garment bag. The moment I saw it, my breath caught in my throat. It was perfect, a delicate peach color that complemented my skin tone, with intricate lace detailing and strategically placed rhinestones that caught the light beautifully. I slipped it on, my heart pounding. As I looked in the mirror, I knew this was it. The dress hugged my curves in all the right places, the color making me look radiant. I felt like a bride, like the successful, confident woman I'd become. Without thinking, I snapped a picture and sent it to Sarah. Despite our differences, she was still my sister, and some small part of me hoped she'd be happy for me. Got my wedding dress, I texted along with the photo. What do you think? Her response was typically Sarah. Bit much, isn't it? You always did like to show off. I sighed, putting my phone away. I don't know why I expected anything different. Carefully, I hung the dress in my closet, already dreaming of the day I'd walk down the aisle in it. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of wedding preparations. Between finalizing the guest list, choosing a venue, and keeping up with my work, I barely had time to breathe, let alone visit my family. One evening, as I was going over seating arrangements, my phone rang. It was my mother. "Monica, we haven't seen you in weeks," she said, her tone accusatory. "Lily's been asking about you." Guilt washed over me. In all the wedding chaos, I'd neglected my relationship with Lily. "I'm sorry, Mom. Things have been crazy with the wedding planning." About that, my mother's voice took on a familiar disapproving tone. "How much are you spending on this wedding? You know, a modest ceremony would be just as meaningful." I frowned. "Mom, I don't think that's any of your business." "Of course it is," she exclaimed. "We're your family. And speaking of family, have you thought about how you could help your sister instead of spending all this money on one day?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Mom," I said, my voice trembling with suppressed anger, "this is my wedding. Alex and I are paying for it ourselves. How we spend our money is our business, not yours, and certainly not Sarah's." "Don't be so selfish, Monica," my mother scolded. "Family should come first." As I hung up the phone, I felt a mixture of anger and sadness wash over me. Even now, with one of the happiest days of my life approaching, my family couldn't simply be happy for me. Everything always had to revolve around Sarah and her needs. Just as the dust was settling from the wedding dress drama, a new storm was brewing. Lily was graduating high school, and with graduation came the inevitable school ball. My phone rang one afternoon while I was in the middle of a photo shoot. Sarah's name flashed on the screen. "Monica," Sarah's voice was demanding as ever. "Lily needs a dress for her graduation ball. I want you to buy her one from that new collection by, what's his name? The famous one you're always going on about." I knew exactly which designer she meant, and exactly how much his dresses cost. "Sarah, those dresses are incredibly expensive. We're talking thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars. I'm not spending that kind of money on a dress Lily will wear once. It's not reasonable." "Fine," Sarah spat. "I'll tell Mom and Dad how greedy you're being. Don't bother calling Lily anymore." She hung up, leaving me standing in the middle of the studio, shaking with anger and frustration. True to her word, my parents called later that day, berating me for my selfishness and lack of family values. After a sleepless night, I came up with a solution. I called Lily, hoping she would answer, despite her mother's threats. "Lily, sweetie," I said, relieved to hear her voice. "I have an idea about your graduation dress. Why don't you come over and borrow one of mine? I have plenty of designer dresses you could choose from." There was a pause, then Lily's excited voice came through. "Really, Aunt Monica? That would be amazing." I could hear Sarah in the background, asking what was going on. After a moment, Sarah came on the line. "Fine," she said grudgingly. "We'll be over next week." A week later, I was at home, deep in concentration as I finished up an article for the magazine. The doorbell rang, and I opened it to find Sarah and Lily. "The dresses are upstairs in the guest room closet," I said, gesturing towards the stairs. "Why don't you two go up and take a look? I just need to finish this article." Sarah nodded curtly and led Lily upstairs. I returned to my computer, immersing myself back in my work. It seemed like only minutes had passed when I heard them coming back down. That was fast, I said, surprised. Did you find something you liked, Lily? But before Lily could answer, Sarah was hurrying her out the door. We need to go, she said abruptly. Thanks for this. A few days after Sarah and Lily's strange visit, I decided to try on my wedding dress again. With all the family drama, I needed a reminder of the joy that was to come. I opened my closet, reached for the garment bag, and it wasn't there. Panic set in as I searched frantically through my entire wardrobe. The beautiful peach dress was nowhere to be found. And then it hit me, Sarah and Lily's hasty departure, their refusal to show me what they'd chosen. They hadn't borrowed a dress, they'd stolen my wedding gown. Furious, I drove to my parents' house. I burst through the door without knocking, making a beeline for Lily's room. There, hanging in her closet, was my peach wedding dress. Lily, I called out, my voice shaking with anger and disappointment. How could you do this? Why would you take my wedding dress? Lily appeared in the doorway, her face pale and eyes wide with shame. Before she could speak, Sarah pushed past her, her face twisted with rage. How dare you barge in here and accuse my daughter? Sarah spat. You're so greedy, you can't even lend a dress to your own niece for her graduation? I was stunned. Lend? Sarah, you stole my wedding dress. This isn't just any dress, it's for my wedding day. Sarah's eyes narrowed. Oh, please, you have plenty of dresses. You're just jealous that Lily will look better in it than you ever could. Jealous? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Sarah, you're the one who's always been jealous. Of my career, my success. The room fell silent. Then, from behind me, I heard my mother's voice. Monica, how dare you speak to your sister that way? I turned to see both my parents standing there, their faces masks of disappointment and anger. But she stole my wedding dress, I protested. My father shook his head. Always so selfish, Monica. Can't you think of anyone but yourself for once? I stood there, feeling like I was drowning. How had this happened? How was I the villain in this story? Without another word, I grabbed my dress and left. The next day, my phone rang. It was Lily. Aunt Monica, I'm so sorry. Her voice was small, trembling. I didn't know it was your wedding dress. Mom said, she said you'd want me to have it. We didn't even look at the other dresses. I'm so sorry. My anger melted away. Of course Sarah had manipulated the situation, used Lily as a pawn in her games. Oh, Lily, I sighed. It's okay. I understand. How about we go shopping for a new dress? Your own dress, not a borrowed one. Really? The hope in her voice was palpable. But I can't afford a nice dress. Don't worry about that, I said. But I have a proposal. The dress will be yours, but you'll pay it off in installments. By helping me with my wedding preparations. The day after our phone call, Lily and I hit the stores. It was a day filled with laughter, honest conversations, and a deepening of our bond. We finally settled on a stunning midnight blue gown that made Lily look like a princess. On the night of her graduation, Lily was radiant. As I watched her laughing with her friends, posing for photos, I felt a bittersweet pang. This wonderful young woman had grown up so fast, and I was grateful to be a part of her life. After the ceremony, as we sat in a quiet corner, I took a deep breath. Lily, there's something I need to tell you. She looked at me, her eyes curious. I've decided not to invite your mother to my wedding, I said gently. And I don't think I'll be communicating with her anymore. Lily nodded slowly, surprising me with her calm reaction. I understand, Aunt Monica. So, does this mean I can't come to the wedding either? Oh, no, I exclaimed. Lily, you're absolutely invited. In fact, I was hoping you'd be one of my bridesmaids. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of wedding preparations, with Lily by my side every step of the way. When my parents found out about my decision to exclude Sarah, they called to inform me that they wouldn't be attending either. To my surprise, I felt more relieved than upset. The day of my wedding arrived, bright and beautiful. As I stood in front of the mirror in my peach dress, Lily helping me with the final touches, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. The ceremony was perfect. Alex's face as I walked down the aisle, the love radiating from our friends and chosen family, Mason's surprising presence, my ex-brother-in-law. It all combined to create a day full of joy and new beginnings. As the reception wound down, Lily approached me, excitement written all over her face. "Aunt Monica, I got into college. In New York. Dad's helping me with the tuition." I hugged her tightly, thrilled for her new adventure. "Oh, Lily, that's wonderful. You're going to do great things, I just know it." In the months that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. Lily moved to New York for college, calling me regularly for advice on everything from fashion to study habits. "I want to be just like you, Aunt Monica," she'd say, making my heart swell with pride. I threw myself back into my work with renewed passion, my personal life finally free from the drama that had plagued it for so long. Alex was supportive and understanding, a true partner in every sense of the word.